Hi, everybody. Yo, the people in the chat, you're impatient. Damn, you need to learn just a little bit of patience. I admit, I also need to learn a little bit better time management. I will admit it. Sorry, I'm 3 minutes late. But god damn. Anyway, good to see a good handful of you waiting. Yeah, I was psyching myself up in the mirror a little bit. I got to get pumped for this. Basically, I just had a very interesting experience in my life. I just experienced something for the very first time in my life, which is at IKEA, I experienced what it feels like to choke on a dick. Like that thing that people say, like, go choke on a dick, bro. Um, I've never like sucked a dick. Therefore, I've never really been in a situation where I could possibly choke on a dick. But I went to IKEA to get some sort of light. I'm trying to work on the lighting in this room when I do these videos. So I went to IKEA to look for some sort of cheap light that might make things a little bit better. And anyway, as always, I'm kind of rushing to do everything in short periods of time. And so I haven't eaten anything all day, so I had to like stop and get food at IKEA, of course, before I got a light. And I had to squeeze all this in like the hour before I was going to do this stream. So I'm rushing, right? Like I'm trying to eat really quick. And I do this all the time. I'm always like, I'm a little disorganized, I admit. I'm always rushing around. And this leads to a few common phenomena, especially with eating. Like I'm always biting my cheek when I eat. It happens to me all the time. It's terrible because I'm like just chewing too fast and it gets fucked up on my mouth and goes onto the cheek. But something new happened today because I was eating a hot dog. This has never happened to me before. I guess I was just eating too fast and being careless. And basically, well, I think you can guess where this is going. Basically, I bit too big. I had a big piece of hot dog, probably like this big, like, the size of like a small wiener, a small dick. And I didn't chew it enough, and it basically slipped down my throat like pretty deep. I was deep throating that baby. And it was scary. Like it was really uncomfortable. I thought like the feeling of choking on a dick is like, it's the feeling of if this goes down any further, I might die. It's very terrifying. So I mean, obviously I don't know what it's like to actually choke on a dick, like a real dick. And I don't mean to be making light of sexual violence or anything like that at all, for real. But I know a little bit now about like what that sensation is, what that experience of literally choking on a dick would be like, roughly. And I've never had that experience before, so it was interesting, and that just happened. So I thought I'd share that with you. All right. So, what else? As you folks know, the format I've been operating on usually is for the first 30 minutes or so, I just kind of talk shit. I talk about whatever I want, tell stories, give you some of my crazy ideas, try to crack jokes that often fail, whatever. So if that's not for you, that's cool. Go do something else. Fuck off. Come back in 30 minutes when Nyx joins us to talk about actually interesting and hopefully deep and fascinating shit, like all about crazy stuff like gender accelerationism. I still don't even really know what that is, but I'm looking forward to learning. And what else? And we're going to talk about lesbian neoreaction, but that'll all start in about 20 minutes or so, about 30 minutes past the hour. Until then, it's just kind of free time to chill and kick it. So look, if you're with me, you can talk in the chat. I'm here. You can pay close attention if you want, but I also would suggest, if you find me boring, if you find this just like I'm blathering on, go do something else. Or, put it on in the background. I like to think of my disquisitions and rants and blathering, would be a nastier way of putting it, as something that some people might enjoy as a kind of background droning to what you're doing. So whatever you choose to do, however you choose to spend the next 20 minutes with me or without me, make yourself comfortable, do what you want to do, set yourself up, and let's slowly get into this. Maybe put on some music if you want. Here in the UK, everyone is watching the World Cup. Like on the way to IKEA, it's actually a really good time to go to IKEA when everyone's watching the World Cup in your country. Every bar that I went past, every pub was just filled with people. I actually felt a little bit of desire to be social. I felt like a slight feeling of like maybe I should be with those people. maybe that would be fun. Maybe I'd like to be a part of it. And then that went away very rapidly. And yeah, here I am. So I'm glad that you're here with me as I'm failing to live up to the expectations of my society and the people around me. All right. Is she really going to dox herself? No, I don't think Nyx is going to dox herself. I think she'll use her avatar. I guess maybe voice dox herself, but I don't think she plans on doxing herself. Just to answer that question real quick. Yeah. All right, cool. So, by the way, folks, like if I don't see a comment and you really want me to respond to it, you might just have to say it a couple times, and I'll try to hopefully get it and try to respond to it if possible. All right. So what else? Well, someone asked me a question recently, made a content request, if you will. And I'm not going to give the proper delivery of this content request, but I will. I did have a thought right before we started this that I could throw on the record real quick, and I'll try to expound on this maybe a little bit more later, and maybe some writing or maybe another video or something like that. But one of you asked me about marriage. One of you asked me to make something or say something about marriage. And it's I think marriage is a really just insane, incredible, phenomenal, crazy thing that human beings do. I mean, as an experience, as a life experience, it's just so insane, really. And I'd like to really explain in more detail what I mean by that, or what I have in mind. And so that is going to deserve much more thought and attention to really do that justice. But one thing I will say, one sort of little tiny, I guess, aphoristic bit of insight that came to me just today, as I guess this was stirring around in my head, is that for me anyway, personally, I think that I really do think that marriage is, at least for me, like the one of the best things you can possibly do. It's one of the craziest things you can possibly do. I think it's like really pretty high stakes thing to irrevocably promise yourself to someone, to irrevocably chain yourself really to a ship with someone else on it, and to really take that seriously, and to, with all your heart and soul, like truly promise yourself and the world that, like, no matter what happens, you're gonna fight for that ship to keep sailing. And so I'll just say simply that in my view, and I need to spend more time to kind of flesh this out and try to help you see why I think this, but just to kind of say what I think right off the bat, I think it's one of the coolest, craziest, most profound, exhilarating, empowering, exciting, energizing, edifying things that I've ever done, for sure. And so, yeah, I'll say that off the bat, but I'll also say off the bat that it also like brings with it some of the worst things ever, to be honest. I mean, because you are like locked in the ship, when you have problems, it sucks. It's like, and it can get really dark, really in a bad way that you don't really know from dating, because with dating, you can just break it off whenever you want. In a marriage where you're really all in and you really mean with your heart and soul, you intend to, like, no matter what, keep that ship sailing and not get off the island, as it were. I don't know why I'm using all these nautical metaphors, but be that as it may, when shit goes fucked up, it's like you get a new and different type of stress and anxiety and panic, kind of like, and it makes sense. Like if you're really bound to this ship for life, and maybe your partner does something really fucked up, or you do something really fucked up, and you're like, you have to really contend with the possibility of, like, is this going to be my life forever? Is my life going to suck forever because of X bad thing that my partner just did, that maybe like really surprised you, maybe a part of them that you never really saw before, and it portends real possible trouble. If it's a serious long-term thing that repeats itself, it maybe would make your life miserable. I mean, that can happen. That can happen. And you have to have the confidence and the patience to try to work through that lovingly and supportively, and have the faith that your partner will do what they need to do, to meet you halfway. And everything I'm saying, your partner is also thinking and feeling about you. So it's like every time there's like, the stakes are higher, really, is all I'm getting at. And when that's a good thing when things are good, and that's a bad thing when things are bad. That might sound kind of trite, but that's the basic idea that I've experienced. And yeah, in a nutshell, that's one of the insights, I guess, that I've had about marriage. But in general, like, I highly, highly recommend it. And I think, like, personally, I think all the 20 somethings and 30 somethings in Western, societies that are putting off getting married are really making a bad mistake. Like, I think it's a major kind of civilization level error and problem. And it's really a result of, like, really stupid, unhealthy, and regressive, like, psychologies or worldviews in like young adults today. I think people are, like, way too picky. I mean, just thinking about myself, like, when I was dating before I got married, like, one thing I think is people are always thinking about, like, can they do better? There's this, like, constant, like, calculation game. And people are just putting it off because they're afraid of commitment and thinking they can do better. It's this, like, infinite kind of instrumental calculation process. But really, actually, you're just wasting yourself away, and you're losing the opportunity to actually engage in a really new kind of life and a new kind of mission, a totally new kind of relationship and project and way of being. And it's awesome. Like, yeah, you want to be careful about who you choose to marry, for sure. You need to be really careful. But man, when it feels right, like, if you got something good, go for it. I think, like, if obviously, who knows what kind of situations you might be in. I can't give you fucking advice on this stuff. It's so complicated in different circumstances. But in general, I'd put it this way: there are a lot of 20 somethings and 30 somethings who have missed good opportunities to get married where they probably should have, or could have, and would probably be much better, happier people had they done it, had they taken the plunge and did it with all of their heart. I think there's a large number of people for whom it could be said, they fucked up by not really pursuing, like, such an opportunity at some point that it presented itself earlier. Because yeah, that's my 2 cents. I'm not being normative about it. Like, there are definitely lots of people who maybe just don't want to get married. Maybe they're just like being alone, all these sorts of things. Obviously, that's fine. There's lots of individual cases. I'm not, saying that everyone absolutely has to do it, and if they don't, they're evil. I'm just saying, someone asked me my opinion about marriage, so I'm giving you my thoughts, just some of my thoughts about it. Yeah, actually, I mean, I guess I said a lot there. I guess I dumped out a fair number of things I think about it. But it is a question that's close to my heart, and something that I think is really profound, and that I would like to spend more time meditating on. So yeah, that was just a little bit of a brain dump, but I'd actually like to maybe do more on that in the future, because I think it's still highly unexplored and really important, actually. Anyway, that was just me. I guess that sounds like a really, like, traditionalist rant or something like that, but I don't know. There are lots of other ways to organize your life that I think are also awesome. And I don't want to sound like a kind of, like, I'm hedging now, and I'm like being a multicultural, like, postmodern relativist or something like that, which I'm not. But all right. Anyway, what else? Okay, what we can do right now for just a minute is a wee bit of housekeeping. I've been doing these streams a lot more recently. By the way, I did actually get that new light today. Does this look any better? Does it look? I'm hoping to make this, like, barf colored room a little less offensive, a little less ugly, by making, like, the background kind of blacker and my front area, like, a little more focused or something. I don't know if it works. If you could see my desk, it looks totally ridiculous. I have this, like, big lantern kind of light set up. Anyway, so I'm trying to actually invest in this a little bit and see if I can make this, like, a cooler and increasingly kind of fun, smooth thing. But as always, my shit is, like, mostly a DIY affair. So yeah, if you come here for, like, high production values, you can click out of this tab now, because that's not exactly what I'm offering. But I will try to kind of make this a little bit more functional and a slightly better production quality as we go iteratively. Other thing on that front, I mentioned this in the stream last night. I'm kind of slowly building in this little private community around these live streams and the videos I've been making, and also the podcast and the blogging and all the stuff that I do. I've been very lucky to be contacted by a fair number, not huge, but like a fair number of a small group of people who are really interested in the stuff I'm putting out. So I decided I wanted to kind of try to like make some sort of shared space where we could, I could hear more from like what you folks are thinking about all the stuff I'm putting out, and help, give you an opportunity to help me, tell me like what you think I should do more of and stuff like that. And also give me critique and feedback or whatever. So I'm slowly building up this little space. Hint, it's going to be a Discord server. And I actually already have it. There are a few kind of people that I'm in contact with who I know fairly well from the internet, who are kind of in it now and helping me kind of build it up a little bit, get the culture moving a little bit. And then like once it's kind of like set up well, and I feel like it's a cool thing, I'll definitely start iteratively welcoming more people into it. So if you've been following the stuff I've been doing and you're interested in it or whatever, and you want to like, have more like close and direct conversations with me or the people in the chat here and whatever, the people kind of around my orbit of the stuff I'm doing and interested in, the themes and topics that I tend to be interested in, definitely, same thing I said last night, like shoot me a message, just get in my DMs or like make some kind of personal contact with me, and let me know that you're interested in that. So you're on my radar, and I'll definitely, it's not going to be like a super exclusive thing. Like if you want in, as long as you're not like a fucking total asshole or something, you can come in. So just get at me and I'll let you know as I'm like letting in more and more people. Again, it's not to be exclusive or anything like that. I'm not trying to make that kind of vibe. Just saying that it's because I want to like, make it good and make it good over time, make it better over time. So I don't want to just like let in as many people as want in right away when like it's still not totally set up and it doesn't have all the bells and whistles I'd really like for it to have. All right. Yes. Only about 10 minutes left until I'll bring in Nyx and we'll talk about cooler stuff. But one other thing that is on my mind, actually kind of inspired by this conversation we're about to do in 10 minutes, is I haven't really, ever since I started doing these streams, I haven't given much thought at all. Like I haven't really given any thought to like my moderation policy. Like I don't have a moderation policy. And now that the public chats are starting to get like pretty active, which is really cool and really fun to see. I'm not like worried, because so far most people in the chats have been totally fine and cool. But I just want to be a little reflective as I go, because, and so here's the thing. So basically I'll give you my thoughts on, I want to give you my thoughts on what is the ideal way to think about moderation and comment, moderation in kind of the open online context we have today, when you are like a free speech absolutist, basically, as I am, but you also don't want to be an asshole, so I just want to reflect on that a little bit, and that'll probably take up the next few minutes, and then we'll basically probably just at that point we'll invite Nyx in. So yeah, see, I said that, and we already got a few trolls trying to provoke me. Please don't do that. I'm not going to. I don't like it. Actually, I just fucked up, because the first thing you don't tell trolls is to not troll you. Anyway, so here's my thoughts on it. Basically, I personally don't really give a fuck what people say. Like I have a very high tolerance for speech and a variety of different political beliefs. And even like, not only do I not really care what people think politically, and very few positions like offend me in my presence, it's more like I guess I just have thick skin to like hate and stuff like that. Like people can sling like the nastiest words of me all they want, and I just have a high tolerance for that. So I'm not really too concerned about controlling that. But I do want to talk with interesting people, and something I've been doing on these streams, as you've seen, is I like to bring in people who want to have interesting conversations with me, and I like to talk with like a very wide variety of people. And it's like, if you're gonna have a guest in your home, you're going to want to make sure that like your neighbors don't like curse at them on their way into your house or something like that. Like if you have any sort of stewardship over that, you want to do, you owe it to yourself and to the people you care about talking with, to kind of like do your best to make sure that doesn't happen or minimize it or whatever. So here's what I think. I'm definitely, I want to reiterate, I want to iteratively reflect on this and maybe update it as we go. But people in the chat, there's only one nasty person so far. I'd say out of the number of you that are in there, that's not so bad. Anyway, whatever. I need to not look at the chat. My 2 cents on this is as follows. I want to have a very open standard for political beliefs. So, like, even political beliefs that many leftist and progressive, respectable people, that it's kind of like my milieu, like academics and whatever, would see as like out of line or out of the acceptable limits. I want to actually push that limit outward. So, I mean, many of you kind of know this about me from my writings and stuff like that. Like, I do think that we should, basically allow a much wider perspective of political stances, even many that my colleagues would consider racist or would consider sexist or transphobic or whatever the case might be. I am interested in creating spaces where, those, taboo political views and attitudes and beliefs can actually, people who have those beliefs can interact with me and with other people. Like, I'm not afraid of that. And I think that is actually in every way a desirable move forward for, public discourse or whatever you want to call it in the culture at large. And also just for like radical truth seeking, which is ultimately what I'm, after personally. So I do want to do that. And that's part of what I'm doing, I think, from like the people I'm talking with and the general orbit that that I'm kind of participating in. But I also do want to like not encourage assholes. So basically, I mean, my where I come down on this is like I think it's pretty straightforward. This is not like a fancy big solution or philosophical revelation or something like that. But it's, I think a practical and defensible way to think about this is the following. It's that I'm basically cool with anyone expressing almost any, I guess really any like sincere political belief or claim in the public chat here, or whatever. Even if like, a lot of people would say that it's racist or whatever, or sexist or whatever the case might be. But if you're like, my line will just be like, if you're like an incessant absolute asshole whose intent seems to me to be like nothing but like anti-intelligent, anti like communicative destruction or obstruction. So like, yeah, I think that that's like a good way to do it. So in other words, like, I want to be radically open with respect to like, as long as you're like saying complete sentences and you seem to be a human being who is trying to say something that is like an empirical statement of any kind that you seem to sincerely believe, or a kind of value claim or attitude or philosophy or position that, you genuinely feel, and you're saying it because that's what you feel. If those are the general intentions and that's all you're doing, and you're not like doing it in a really like repetitive, aggressive, or like way it design, like if you're not trying to intimidate, and I have a pretty like open mind as to like what I consider intimidation or whatever, then I'm not gonna like favor that or disfavor that. I'm not gonna boot you for that. I'm not gonna moderate those comments or like delete those comments or suppress them or whatever. But the only thing I would ask is like, you're not allowed to be an asshole to like and I don't just mean, by the way, like, I know a lot of lefties say that like, hey, I'm just banning you because you're an asshole. But actually, like, they have an extremely low bar for what counts as asshole, and like even someone just saying a political belief that they find offensive counts as being an asshole. So that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying like, I have a very high tolerance, and you have to be a real asshole. Like, I'm not going to just call anyone an asshole and whatever, be repressive about it. But yeah, that's basically my stance, is that as long as I don't have a like overly sensitive threshold, and like, so in other words, like, you have to be an actual asshole that no one would deny you're just being an asshole. That's what you have to be for me to boot you or to moderate your comments or repress you or whatever. Okay. That's my policy. Now, having said that, that's just my philosophy. I haven't I don't even know how to moderate the YouTube chat yet. So, but I have a bot. I have Nightbot working for me. So, rest assured, there are some constraints. All right. So, yeah, see, like General Butt Naked just got booted by Nightbot. AI to the rescue. Thank you. Yeah, exactly. So I'm kind of on top of shit. If we keep doing this and everyone is having fun with this, and I keep doing it as I want to, as I'm planning to, I'll get, I'll learn the ropes of these things and get a little bit more sophisticated with moderating, with greater, sophistication and stuff like that. All right, so is that enough ranting and housekeeping and shit like that? I think we can move on to the main focus of tonight's live stream. And just one last thing real quick before I invite Nyx, or actually let me invite Nyx, and then while we're waiting for her to enter, I can tell you the last little bit of housekeeping. All right, got the link. Let me just gotta go to the DMs. Right. So the one last thing I wanted to say was that I've committed to a schedule that I'm gonna get feedback. I've committed to a schedule that I'm going to do these live streams on, so that we can build some kind of like reliable expectations. Like you know when I'll be on. If you're finding this fun and cool, you can join me at a reliable repeating time. And that time is going to be, just so you know, put it in your calendars. Actually, it's not that important. Definitely don't put it in your calendars. Put in your calendars more important things that you should be doing, like, writing and shit. But if you're curious, the times are going to be 3 p.m. Eastern time on Tuesdays. All right. That's 8 p.m. in the UK and 5 a.m. in Australia. I'm going to do a stream every week for at least the next few weeks. Figure like at least, 2 or 3 weeks at the very least. But if people are into this, I'm definitely into it. This is fun as hell for me. So I'll definitely keep going with it if you all want to keep going with it. 3 p.m. Eastern on Tuesdays, and then it'll be Saturdays at 9 a.m. Eastern. So that's to make it a little bit more, to mess with the times for the other time zones. So for instance, like people in Australia, I know there's a few of you from Australia, it'll be easier to tune into that one. It'll be 11 p.m. at Australia, but it's Saturday night. So like whatever, you can stay up late. And that'll be 2 p.m. in the UK, and that'll be on Saturdays. And then I'll do like one-off streams like this one. Like if I have to work around other people's schedules, there'll be random ones like this. All right. So yeah, just wanted to say that Nyx should be joining us any minute now. All right. Until then, I can take a breather and we can just wait. By the way, can everyone hear me okay? Is the audio and video all right? By the way, is this light like any better? Or is it still just equally crap? Okay, this moderation is actually not that hard. Like, I can put people in timeout. That's so hilarious. All right. Nyx, where are you at? Come on, Nyx. I thought you were a techie. What's taking you so long? Just kidding. I'll give Nyx a quick introduction for those of you who need that. I don't know that much about Nyx, but I have been chatting with Nyx for quite a while now, actually. So I know them a little bit. We're friendly. And I believe that she is a programmer of some kind or has technical skills. She talks about that stuff a lot. And she's fairly notorious, I would say, on Twitter. Her avatar is like a photoshopped version of Nick Land's face. Pretty funny. And yeah, she's got some pretty far out ideas about gender and about lesbianism. Again, I actually, even though we've chatted quite a lot, I think I've grokked a little bit of a sense of, you know, where she's going with these ideas, but I still don't really understand them as much as I would like to, but they certainly sound fascinating. And I'm just kind of curious to hear a little bit more specifically, you know, what she has in mind with these ideas. So I'm gonna follow up and see what's good with Nick's land. I'm sure they're just like getting a drink or something. I just want to make sure that there's no problem with the with anything. Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah, she's got it. She's just logging in. No worries. Take your time, Nix. Yeah, so I'm just a never-ending well of words, so I can easily keep you entertained. But now would also be a good time if you want to go take a bathroom break, relieve yourself, whatever. By the way, last night I know that there was a little bit of noise or feedback, I think, in some of the parts of the chat. None of you told me about that though, so I'm hoping that's because it didn't bother you and you barely noticed it. But yeah, in the future, if there's ever any problem, like if the audio or the video is shit, definitely just let me know. Because like I said, I'm not, you know, some super professional YouTuber or something like that. I don't really know exactly how, you know, how these, I don't have some like fancy mixer. I haven't like spent a bunch of money on gear or any shit like that. Right. So what else? Who's in the chat? Who's in the house? We got a lot of people in the house tonight. I think 60 viewers is, I think that might be an all-time high. So I think it shows the public interest in Nick's land and gender accelerationism. So that's cool. Don't go anywhere. I don't want to lose you all. Nix is just having an issue with the VPN. See, this is the issue with techies. You know, they're really good with computers, but sometimes I do this too. Like I get a little too good with computers for my own good. Because then what I do is I make all these like complicated systems, and then they break, and then you like, you know, have to troubleshoot all the time. But no worries. What I really need is like an assistant, like an unpaid intern, who can be here with me in person, who can like help out with the computer and like look shit up and deal with like bringing guests in. Because right now I'm like talking and trying to entertain you and trying to negotiate this with Nix. So bear with me. We have to do this through super dangerous, esoteric, highly secretive, cryptographically blocked and protected methods. I would tell you about it, but then we'd have a major problem. I'd have to have you dealt with, if you know what I'm saying. All right, I think that we should be good. I think Nick should be with us any minute. Am I in London? Someone asked me in the chat. No, I'm not. I am in a small city. Well, it's not that small, but small in terms of like international recognition. About an hour south on the train on this south coast. Yeah. Well, everyone is a little bit gay, at least. I wonder about that theory. Well, that actually might be one of the things we might talk about. Nix, can you hear me?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, you're a little soft, but could you turn up the volume a little bit, maybe?
Yeah, just a sec. How's that?
Yeah, that sounds perfect. How do I sound? Am I loud and clear to you?
Yep.
All right, awesome. Thanks so much for agreeing to chat with me.
Yeah, no problem. man, we scheduled this for like originally in April or May or something, I think, but I finally was able to do it.
Yeah, we have been trying to get this together for a while, but I'm glad it's finally coming together. And yeah, so I also missed you in San Francisco, unfortunately. Oh shit, did
Yeah.
I don't know if that's, well, everyone knows you're like techie, so people might just assume.
Oh,
Anyway.
yeah, no, I'm open about being a California native.
Oh,
It's
good. Man, I
the
just got
the Bay Area is such a huge area that, and I'm not even living there right now anyway. So even there's a low chance of getting doxxed and stalked if I just say I'm in the Bay Area.
Okay. Oh, I'm so glad you said that. I just got really, my heart started racing. I just started getting, I got really scared that maybe I just doxed your location and you didn't want that. And I just got this conversation off on the worst foot. So that's good.
Yeah, I was about to immediately log off.
Oh man, I just got so worried that I did that. So okay, we're good. I'm glad to hear that. So how you doing today? What's going on?
Um, I'm really not doing anything. I was just kind of cleared my schedule to be on here today
Awesome.
and kind of at my desk passively monitoring some stuff.
Awesome. Great. So we can, if you want to, just jump right into the interesting, deep philosophical and political topics that we've roughly, I think, kind of planned to talk about. Or if there's anything on your mind, like more interesting everyday life things that you're just dying to chit chat about, we can do that too.
Yeah, I wasn't. I mean, I had assumed that we would be talking about the theory type stuff that I promote all the time on Twitter. But yeah, I mean, we can. Obviously, we have to address necrophilia at some point. I think that that kind of goes without saying that everybody's expecting that.
You're right. I didn't even mention that in the promos for this, but we'll address that also for sure. Real quick, actually, this would be a good time to say we got like 60 people in the house, which is pretty dope. That for me, for my little stream, that's actually quite a lot. So that's really exciting. But for those of you listening right now, if you don't mind, if you know people or there are people in your network who you think are really interested in this stuff, go ahead and put out a retweet for the link to this video right now, because it's hopefully gonna get interesting from about now. So far, Nyx, it's just been me ranting. I don't know if you were watching, but usually what I do for the first 30 minutes is just kind of say whatever I want, rant, talk about shit. All right. So now that you're here, let's do this. So you're kind of associated, people associate you with, I guess, a few slogans, if you will. And I think this is partially your doing. I think you've put out a lot of writing and also memes and just general. You put out a very active web presence promoting ideas around, to use your own language, these terms such as lesbian neoreaction. And I've also heard you talk about and write about gender accelerationism, which is why I put these things in the title. Maybe we could just start off simple. We don't have to like get too deep or sophisticated, but maybe I could just ask you one at a time. Could you tell us just briefly in your own words, like, what does gender accelerationism mean even? Like, I think a lot of people know what accelerationism means, so I won't go over that. But I think a lot of people are like, well, how can that happen? Or how does that work with gender? Like, what exactly does that involve or imply or entail? I think that's not obvious to people. So maybe just in your own words, you could tell us a little bit about what that means to you.
Yeah. So the gender accelerationism thing, by the way, it's I wrote the well, I actually wrote two different versions of the thing that I'm going to be publishing soon on Vastabrupt. I think the first one I wrote like last summer, maybe, and then I wrote another one that was completely different earlier this year. And the one that I'm going to be publishing is I've been working on editing it this week, and I've been hyping it up forever, but I'm finally going to get around to publishing it, and that's going to be pretty soon. Like, I'm hoping by the end of the week or next week, maybe,
Oh, awesome.
depending on how long it takes to finish editing and everything. But
that's a good strategy though. Like very long periods of hype process and building suspense. It's good strategy. It's not unlike Nick's Bitcoin book.
yeah, and also video game type culture stuff I just thought of does the same thing, so it's kind of funny. But yeah, as far as what it actually is, I think that I originally heard the term gender accelerationism from one of my mutuals on Twitter who um their name is Vicky Storm, and they're like an anarchist post left egoist type of person, queer, and I don't know if they had written something on it. I heard that they did, but I was never able to find it. But I read a couple excerpts from it, and the basic idea behind it was similarly to Xenofem. The Xenofeminist Manifesto was the "Let a Thousand Sexes Bloom" idea that what's being accelerated is however many distinct genders there are in the world. And my take on gender accelerationism is almost the opposite, but not exactly. I mean, like on Twitter, I meme a lot about like lesbian RX being basically the politicization of forced feminization, uh, and joking about it being an authoritarian, like forcing all men to take estrogen type thing. But it's really more of a it's really more along the lines of esoteric neoreaction, like Nick Land does. Specifically, his there's a post from Xenosystems, meta neocameralism, where he kind of alludes to how patchwork functions in relationship to the outside, basically, or anarchy as I conceptualize it. And so I'm kind of getting ahead of myself talking about lesbian RX now too, but
that's okay. Yeah, whatever you want.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just gonna circle around to answering the first question, but basically, so my take on gender accelerationism or gender acceleration is not that what's being accelerated is the existence of many distinct genders, because the idea, as I understand it, is that accelerating gender in that way to whatever capacity it even makes sense to say that you're accelerating gender by creating more genders. The idea being that the logic of gender collapses at a certain point if there's just too many in the world. And my criticism of this is, on the one hand, that it's not real. My criticism of it is that it's not really destroying the concept of gender itself, but really just broadening it more to a more almost like refining it further. Like a good example of this being, I don't know when this was exactly. It was a couple years ago, and they've changed it since then. But on Facebook, they for a while had the option to add like 57 different genders or something like that, and they changed it to where you could just put in whatever you want now, I think. But basically, it's that same sort of idea that you're only creating more and more distinct identities that are still being captured under the same kind of social categorization. And my take on gender accelerationism is the opposite, in the sense that you accelerate and eventually destroy gender altogether by basically basically pushing the tension that's kind of inherent in gender, in the concept of gender, between like the masculine and the feminine, the in broader terms, like chaos and order, deterritorialization and reterritorialization.
Okay.
The idea being that you kind of accelerate the war between the sexes, as I also put it, to the point that that the feminine overtakes the masculine as the quote unquote dominant gender. and in doing so, that destroys the concept of gender altogether. Because
Okay.
if that makes sense.
So
Because
you're against the idea of having so many genders that gender kind of goes away as a distinct and relevant operating category. You don't like that vision. You actually want to maintain a strong and clear distinction between the two genders, and you want the feminine to dominate. Is that, do I understand you right?
kind of, it's, I mean, I say that it's not exactly how I kind of meme it as being an authoritarian sort of. I mean, it sounds like it from what I just said, but it's like it's more of like the way I put it when talking about lesbian RX being like the political kind of fallout of what happens as a result of gender acceleration, which is more like the theoretical back end to it. But the way I put it in terms of lesbian RX is not that I think that any identity should be policed, or that there will be such a thing as like people, for instance, who are non-binary or whatever, will just be outright excluded and oppressed and marginalized like they are now. It's more that I think that as far as I hate using the word history because that makes it sound like I'm a Hegelian or something. But as far as like the thrust of history goes or whatever, as far as like the war goes, the the two sides of it that are going to have the most relevance are this gender binary of masculine and feminine, and you'd
Okay.
have like other things that don't fit into this binary that people were in, like a patchwork scenario where people can align themselves with whichever one they think is the most appropriate for them. And what I would predict would be that not like non-binary whatever people would side with my would side with my position, since being not fitting into the gender binary is to be, I think, in a sense, to be feminized any in any event anyways, at least by patriarchal standards.
Okay.
If that
Okay.
makes more sense.
I think so. Let me try to say it back, and you can tell me if I'm understanding right or not. So it sounds like you're not hostile to anyone outside of the gender binary,
No, not
but
at all.
but you do think that the primary distinction between the two main genders should be maintained and actually accelerated, like made increasingly kind of harsh and clear, and to the point that um everyone who doesn't sort of map onto that clearly will, in your view, naturally default to, well, I'm sure you don't like the word naturally, but will default to the feminine mode, or the feminine side, I guess you could say. And that will then, I guess, trigger some sort of mechanism tending to, I guess, like, how would you put it, like overthrow the patriarchy, or like uh change it, or what's, first of all, am I kind of with you so far? And second of all, if I am, where how do you see like the end game playing out, or like where does it go, and like as it develops?
I think that we're more or less on the same page. It's a bit harder to talk about the actual political fallout of everything, the lesbian RX side of it right now, because I only have some kind of scattered notes about that. But basically, uh, actually, let me open that right now because I have some stuff
Yeah,
on it.
sure. And obviously, I mean, I know I'm giving like a very kind of cartoonish kind of recapitulation of what you're saying, but I think it's useful for people who are like, who maybe don't have much of a clue of what you're even talking about, to try and parse like in a, easily interpretable way. I'm not trying to like dumb it down, but I'm just trying to make it like in conversational terms, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. Um, so basically, as far as trying to think of exactly how it was that you put it just now, but the way that this works, as far as gender being abolished goes, and as far as uh, how it works, and not just in accelerationist terms, in terms of just like gender being accelerated, but in terms of also accelerationism as a whole, is that the the kind of I guess the patriarchal side of things is I typically put as being aligned with humanism, and that the patriarchy is it essentially exists to again using the term reterritorialize in kind of like a casual way, I guess, but it kind of reterritorializes the reproductive the reproductive potential of women, like of at least of the female sex, towards continuing the human species. And this is something that is becoming increasingly unnecessary as far as the net labor power of the world goes, as far as production itself goes, because it basically that reproductive futurism is archaic and unnecessary, because production can be done in a rate so much faster than humans are capable of doing by techno capital, basically. And I'm also kind of coming from a position of like how Sadie Plant aligns women in computers, women in techno capital. That there's like a common there's a commonly shared goal, at least for the time being, between women emancipating themselves from the kind of biological duty to reproduce, both to reproduce like sexually, and also to reproduce the labor of the man, to reproduce the labor, sorry, of the man.
Right.
Reproduction of labor in like the sense that Sylvia Federici uses it.
Right. Okay. Okay.
Uh,
So I'm you see a kind of coming future in which technology basically emancipates women from the reproductive function. It sounds like. Um, I guess one question I would have for you is like why. I think a lot of people who think like that, who are into that kind of like techno futurist, kind of transhumanist type of those sort of circles or those sort of worldviews, I think those people often have the view that you articulated at the beginning, that you were kind of using as a foil against which to describe your view. This idea that basically like gender itself is being kind of obliterated because we can just hack our biology, and everyone can kind of make their own genders. We can basically like manipulate ourselves to all kinds of segmented, very fine degrees. So, like, what do you like? Why are you not into that, or like why do you think it's important to preserve the gender binary? I'm just curious.
it's not that I think it's um like I said before, it's not necessarily that I think it needs to be preserved in like an oppressive authoritarian sense, because it's important to, I guess, for me to point out that I also have like an anarchist background / consider myself an anarchist. So I don't think that there is like this need to to preserve a gender binary in an authoritative sense to accelerate things, kind of like, in a neo-reactionary, or like in an esoteric neo-reactionary sense of like you kind of you preserve the state in order to accelerate techno capital. Um, it's more that I think that the actually existing way that things are going to happen is less of a utopian kind of transhumanist futurist way, that and especially a not humanist. I don't think it was humanist. I'm trying to remember what the word was that I was thinking of in relation to that. But
Yeah.
basically that yeah, that I'm not as optimistic, I guess, that things are just going to work out, of like, in the sense of like, oh, everybody can just biohack themselves and become at whatever gender they want, and let a thousand sexes bloom and whatever. Like I said, I think that the as far as how things shake out in like a kind of in like actually existing political struggles, sorry,
Yeah.
is that the the most represented and most dominant the most dominant and most represented genders, the gender binary, is going to be what's at the forefront of any kind of war between the sexes.
Okay.
And that what I'm saying about women being emancipated from the need to reproduce biologically, because reproduction can be done by machines, is it's not I'm squaring that off very much from a accelerationist stance, obviously. So from a stance where capitalism is still being preserved and not some kind of like uh, revolutionary leftist, uh,
Right.
we abolish capitalism type thing. And
Right.
this is a more, I guess this is also more relevant to where do I have this in here? This is more relevant to gender accelerationism too. That capitalism essentially is. I can't remember exactly where I had this, but
That's okay.
basically that capitalism is sorry, I
No,
have
it's
so
cool.
much here. I'm trying to think of how to break down my argument
No,
into
that's cool.
like,
That's totally cool. Let me maybe let me help by interjecting with
yeah, definitely.
just an adjacent thought. Well, one thing is I was kind of falling into the trap of kind of framing my questions as somewhat normative, and I think that that was just a bad habit because I think when a lot of people think about feminism and they think about like trans politics and these sorts of things, like the it's so much of it is in a kind of normative, kind of moralistic frame. But of course, now that I think about it, like you probably don't see it that way as much. Like you are you issuing from more of a kind of empirical perspective, because generally like those of us kind of in this like accelerationist orbit, like we tend to have like very constrained views on like the role of human agency and our ability to like make ethical choices that like have any impact. That tends to be like a relatively small point of focus, I think, in like the accelerationist worldview. So, like it is much of what you're thinking about with respect to gender accelerationism and these ideas of like lesbian neoreaction. This is largely a kind of like, you think this is happening, like whether we like it or not. Like you think that like this is how capitalism is going to unfold and is unfolding imminently. Is that
Yeah,
kind of, is that what you
yeah,
think? Or
that's a really good way to put it. I tend to forget, I guess, that a lot of that a lot of the discourse in feminism and queer theory is based around like a moral point of view, because I'm so detached from it. Like I actually, aside from a couple things here and there, like Simone de Beauvoir, I've basically had like no engagement whatsoever with mainstream feminist thought, for better or worse. But that's just an aside that I think is kind of funny. But yeah, no, that's exactly the right way to characterize gender accelerationism, is that the gender accelerationist side specifically is an analysis of how techno-capital is feminizing the human race, and how the feminization of the human race via techno-capital is creating this tension that's going to result in either um, techno-capital and femininity being kind of pitted against masculinity and humanism,
okay,
patriarchy, and decelerationism. That's another thing that I've been working on, that I wrote a little bit of yesterday for my cyber nihilism series. That is one of the other things that I'm more well known for, at least amongst anarchist circles, is an analysis of the phenomenon that I've noticed lately of anarcho-primitivism, or just kind of primitivism in general, green politics in general, and reactionary politics. That I've noticed that there's been a lot more of that lately, especially there's two groups. There's two groups in Mexico, I think. I think they're both in Mexico. I know one is, but there's individuals tending towards the wild, which is the acronym in Spanish is ITS, and the other one is a journal called Atasa, and both of them call themselves eco-extremists, and they both are pretty controversial in the anarchist milieu for being very uncomfortably close for a lot of people to reactionary ideology. And I think it's really interesting how this has happened, because I'm like not at all afraid to say in anarchist circles or whatever that I think that primitivism is essentially reactionary. On the one part, because it's literally saying the modern world is bad. There was a specific time in human history that's good and that we need to go back to, which is pre-agrarian hunter-gatherer societies. And it of course denies disabled and trans people any bodily autonomy, because if there's no industrial society, then most people who have like any kind of medical conditions don't have access to the care that they need or the medicine that they need, and trans people don't have access to the medicine and surgeries and whatnot that they need to transition, if of course they elect for that. Because as another thing I always point out is you don't have to medically transition to be trans. And of course primitivists will say, oh well, you don't have to transition medically, or you don't have to be treated with whatever modern medicine affords us to be able to live a full life as a disabled person or a trans person. And so on the one hand, that's maybe a less interesting criticism if you just stop it there. But what a lot of people also don't point out, mostly because I think anarchists tend to lack a strong theoretical lens, is that basically primitivists make it so that everybody has to conform to their like kind of universalist politics, where if like if you were to ask, well, couldn't there be a patchwork scenario where primitivists could like go shit in the woods or whatever they want to do, and then accelerationist techie whatever people can live in cities? And they'll say, oh well, no, because you might pollute the stream that I get my water from, or you might destroy my forests or whatever, so you need to conform to the way I want to live my life. Everybody has to regress back to this pre-agrarian society, or there's going to be like this there's going to be this extremely tiny portion of the world that's going to be upset by this. So
okay, that's all super interesting. I have to digest that. But one thing that came to mind when you were talking just now is you were kind of criticizing primitivism for being reactionary, but I think some people will be confused because you endorse reactionism, don't you? So what am I missing something maybe?
Yeah, I can understand how that would be confusing.
So in what sense are you a neo-reactionary, and in what sense are you not? Maybe that's a good question.
Yeah, again, the neo-reaction stuff is partially just me memeing and being edgy, because I think it's funny to like steal that from neo-reactionaries, because typically, especially on Twitter, I find that neo-reactionaries, aside obviously from Nick Land and Moldbug, that neo-reactionaries tend to basically just be a couple steps away from being outright fascist, or just generic conservative type people, like the trad phenomenon in that circle. So part of it is just hashtag lesbian rx. A neo-reactionary sees something like that, and it's like, how does that even work? What the fuck? But then part of it is also coming from like a Landian point of view, that it's an esoteric neoreaction where you react or you reterritorialize or whatever in order to um in order to accelerate the process further, which, to be fair, is not a concept that I've entirely entirely understand as far as Nick Land's NRX turn, which is why I haven't really started writing Lesbian NRX, aside from a couple notes on it. So that's just something that'll have to be developed further. But
Sure.
um, yeah, as far as like I guess basically it's important to just say then, is for this specific question, that it's a distinction between reactionaries in a generic sense of being, because it's also important to remember that Nick Land uses reaction and progressivism in very different ways than most people do, where for Nick Land, the left is anything that's against capital and anything that's on the right is aligned with capital. So you might say that reactionary ideologies such as fascism are, in Nick Land's point of view, basically leftist, and that neo-reactionary ideologies like neo-reaction are on the right because they're aligned with capital. And so then in that sense, I would say that I am neo-reactionary by being aligned with techno-capital,
Okay.
both in terms of what I was saying earlier about how techno-capital and is basically ends up being emancipatory for women, and also in the sense of being an anarchist, being a market anarchist, and being in favor of capital as far as its ability to, as far as its use as a tool for managing resources and stuff like that, as
Okay.
opposed to like anarcho-communism.
I think that made things come through quite clearly just now for me. I think I think I understand kind of your larger perspective quite well now, because if you're a lot, it is kind of interesting actually to think about it, that if you're aligned with techno capital, there's a strange way in which, like right now, we are kind of seeing the rise of women in some sense, kind of corresponding to a certain autonomization of capital, kind of escaping the control of governments. At the same time, at least in like the most advanced capitalist societies, you are seeing this kind of interesting kind of cultural ascendancy of things like mainstream feminism and things like that, and like women doing better in school and this sort of stuff. I'm not like some men's rights activist, but there are like a bunch of interesting data points, right, about how like in a strange way, as the acceleration of techno capital is kind of destroying our society like pretty rapidly, and it's very brutal and has like really some really negative effects on many humans. There is a kind of strangely correlated sort of cultural ascendance of a certain form of like cultural female power, and I'm not necessarily like saying that to signal my affiliation with like anti-feminist like people or anything like that. It's more like, because I don't think it's that simple. But do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, Sadie Plant was talking about that as far back as the 90s when she wrote Zeros Plus Ones, that it was already happening where as capitalism accelerates further. And it's important to point out too that this is only the case in the first world. Like if you read Federici's Caliban and the Witch, she talks about how um, primitive accumulation, uh, how basically it basically reterritorializes any apparent freedoms that she thinks women had in the Middle Ages, uh, back to where they're forced to be housewives and to both literally reproduce labor by giving birth to more children that could be in the sweatshops and stuff, and then also to reproduce the labor of her husband, because capitalism at that stage is so brutal and so dependent on human labor that basically laborers aren't able to take care of themselves when they come home from like a 12-hour shift, so they need a household servant essentially to do that for free, which is where I think it was the Italian feminist movement, autonomous group Lotta Feminista, was the one that started this. Where this is basically where their idea of wages for housework comes from. That if you have to pay women a wage to be housewives, then that kind of collapses the system because then you don't have that massive pool of unpaid labor that's reproducing everything else. But that's a bit off track from what you were just saying, though. But just my point being that at different stages of development, capitalism is obviously not emancipatory for women. But the more it accelerates, the more it, again, like I was saying, it gets deterritorialized further to where we are now, where women no longer have to be housewives in the United States for the most part, other than, there's like the cultural residue where women are expected to, but there's no biological or economical reason for it anymore in the US. Like women can be in the workforce now, and there's really no reason for them not to be. But it's actually that's actually part of the inspiration for gender acceleration, specifically as far as trans women go and their role in all this, because it's not just that women as a whole are being emancipated or whatever, emancipated, or at least being afforded more freedoms or as much freedom as men. It's also that trans women have taken on this very interesting kind of role or stereotype, where trans women are, the stereotype that all trans women are programmers, it's not even just a stereotype too. It's also been the subject of study that trans women, specifically, I think it was AGP, autogynephilic trans women, in the Blanchard typology, which people keep asking me about the Blanchard typology for some reason on my RetroSpring. I don't know why. I don't really have many thoughts on it other than, it. I don't know if I agree with it, but I also don't really care, as long as there's nobody being told, well, you can only transition if you are really truly a woman and not AGP. Because even Blanchard says that trans women who are AGP should still transition because it's better for their mental health. But setting that aside, so the study that I referenced a couple seconds ago basically concluded that trans women who are to put it in terms that make sense to most people, because the terms that the article uses are pretty archaic, but basically the trans women who are queer and who transition later in life, I think it would be after puberty, tend to have far higher IQs than most of the population. Like I think it was like 20 something points difference, something really big like that. So it was that, and then also these stereotypes about trans women being programmers that led me to wonder, why is that the case, and is there something more to it? And basically what I came to conclude in gender acceleration is that the reason why this is the case is because phallus, in a broad sense, humanism, patriarchy, all that, is becoming deprecated by all of these productive forces, these inhuman productive forces that are faster, more efficient, and hostile to us. And trans women are basically a more intelligent, more evolved state of the human being that has caught on to this and knows that it's best to abandon any kind of biological duty for reproduction and maintaining patriarchy.
Okay.
Because
Yeah.
it's completely at odds to all this. And I think the way Xenogothic put it in one of his blog posts, to paraphrase him, is that being a trans woman is being more worthy and more attuned to the flows of techno capital.
Okay. So that's super fascinating, and I think that was a very clear statement of that was a very provocative but clear statement of one of the components of your larger picture of the world. So I think that came through very usefully. I feel like we've covered a lot of ground, and I think we've, by now kind of pieced together the main pieces, at least, of, these larger ideas of gender accelerationism and lesbian NRX. I mean, obviously we haven't gone into it in that much depth. I'm sure your writings on it will, answer a lot of the questions people might have about it. But I think its overall contours, at least in my mind, as I've been listening to you talk about it, its overall contours are kind of in place, I think, at this point. Would you mind if I tried to do a little bit of a riff, like recapitulating kind of what you said, maybe, I guess, adding a little bit of maybe my own, like, how things look to me, and you can just tell me if it jives with like how you see things or not?
Yeah, that's fine. There's one other thing I wanted to mention as regards techno-capital and feminization. It's not just necessarily that trans women have higher IQs and that techno-capital is obviously at odds with the human race, and I align patriarchy and techno-capital, or I align patriarchy with humanism, and because of reproductive futurism. It's also There's also further kind of scientific evidence, or whatever you want to call it, that indicates towards this. There is an article a last November, I want to say, that was talking about, what was it? I think it was the Great Barrier Reef, or where is it? I have it right here. That yeah, the Great Barrier Reef. That it's turning the rising temperatures in the Great Barrier Reef are turning sea turtles female. So there was that, and then there's also a pretty widely studied and well-known phenomenon that in the first world, testosterone levels are falling at a rapid rate, and nobody knows why that's happening. Because on the one hand, you could blame this on like poor diets and lack of exercise in developed countries, which I think is a secondary but also important part of this. That the faster techno capital goes, the more you have to be plugged into cybernetics, you plugged into like the matrix or whatever, which is also a great term because matrix comes from a Greek word for womb, which a lot of people know. I think it's a famous comparison. But also that as techno capital accelerates and it demands us to keep up with it, and our bodies basically become useless because naturally we can't keep up with it, and we have to plug everything into cybernetics. And then also, the poor diet part, you could attribute to that too. That I actually just answered a question today or the other day, I think, actually, about this and like the soy boy phenomenon. That it's like meat and stuff like that has a lot of testosterone, it's a it is conducive to having high testosterone levels. Stuff like that is basically an unnecessary luxury item for human beings now. It's more efficient and cheaper for people to be eating food that's soy based and is not masculinizing. But
Okay.
the really interesting point underlying the testosterone dropping point, and then we can move on to what you were going to do, is that nobody has an explanation for this yet. I mean, there have been some suggestions that maybe it has something to do with changes in the climate, that heat feminizes, which would seem to dovetail nicely into that point about the Great Barrier Reef. But either way, there are multiple sources that seem to indicate there's a clear parallel between acceleration and feminization. Sorry, I know I'm very long-winded.
No, that's awesome. That's really good. That's what this is for, like, for us to just kind of talk as long as we want to try to get it all out there. And I think actually you really have painted a clear picture for me now. And I really do kind of see even better what you're going for here. And I like your data points. I mean, those are really interesting, like the turtles and the phenomenon of soy boys. These are, you do paint an evocative picture that is not implausible. So what I want to just briefly do is try to one more time, after trying to digest everything you've already said, kind of recapitulate what you said, and just to confirm that I do understand you clearly. And then maybe we can pick at it a little bit more. Like it sounds to me like what you're saying is that the acceleration of techno-capitalism is basically putting an increasingly brutal pressure on the social fabric. And what that's doing, basically all I mean by that is, the basic ability for human beings to live as human beings is increasingly coming under this like unbearable pressure, as the competitive demands of survival under techno-capitalism accelerate. And what this is doing is, well, it's making it really hard to be a man, basically, and is one way to think about what you're saying. And that actually, interestingly, kind of jives with, like a lot of the neo-reactionary people who the more, not even neo-reactionary, but like the more kind of typical like that's a pretty typical like conservative line that modern Western societies are inimical to masculine virtues or whatever. Like it sounds like you're kind of saying like that's true. Techno capital is making it increasingly impossible for men to be men, and that what this is doing is it's actually pushing people to kind of align themselves with the feminine, and that might mean the ascendance of women, as you see in like I don't know, whatever, like all the campus politics that people are talking about, like feminism and Me Too, and this whole like Sheryl Sandberg like lean in corporate feminism, like all of those currents would in your model be seen as data points of femininity kind of rising on a kind of cultural ascendance, that's in part because techno capital is obliterating masculine prowess in some sense, and also like people transitioning genders would be another data point of this kind of the way in which techno capital is basically pushing human energy towards, let's say, like non-masculine or even anti-masculine forms. And so that's really fascinating. Is that so in other words, that's the gender accelerationism component. Like what that refers to is basically just the effects that techno-capitalism is having on gender dynamics. And interestingly, what I like about that idea of gender accelerationism is it's kind of consistent with like the left and the right, or like, not that maybe that's not the best way to put it, but rather like a lot of the claims of the left are actually consistent with the gender accelerationism, and a lot of the claims of the right are. In other words, like the left that kind of says that like capitalism is bad, it hurts people, it is bad for the soul, these sorts of moralistic kinds of objections. Like you're kind of saying like, yeah, that's pretty true, but maybe it's a good thing, or maybe that's just uncontrollable, and it's ironically having kind of feminist implications. Whereas on the other hand, the right also kind of points to similar phenomenon. They say like, this is really bad for traditional values. We need to like restore the family or whatever. So like there are different kind of ideological moves that one can make in response to this phenomenon that techno capital is putting increasing pressure on gender norms, and kind of, yeah, as you describe it. So I see that as the gender accelerationist idea as maybe a pretty compelling way to kind of describe the relationship between capital and gender in a way that is actually, it's not really left or right. It's more maybe like what we would call like unconditional accelerationist or whatever. But it seems to be consistent with the data points that are kind of invoked on both sides. Does that make sense to you or no?
Yeah, there's actually one of my mutuals on Twitter who's like a reactionary right decelerationist type person. He said once, we basically, him and I have the same beliefs, except I just think that all of these things, that techno capital is destroying humanity and techno capital is unleashing the chaotic feminine and destroying the family and all of that. I just think all of that's great. And reactionaries are terrified of this. And
Right.
I would say because you were talking about like the cultural the cultural phenomenon of feminism, and what the and I think that even to a certain extent, which is why I'm critical of but will be more so critical in Lesbian RX than in GAC. I'd originally had like a little section at the end talking about xenofem, but I decided that I needed to, because so much of the left is talking about the political and moralistic implications of everything, and less doing a kind of analytical back end analysis of all of it. So, but basically, yeah, I'm also critical of the left's responses to it, and for while the right saying this is capitalism is destroying masculinity, destroying traditional values and all that, and you know I think that the left to a certain extent is having, by being anti-capitalist, is having similar objections to it, except instead of framing it in terms of this kind of this hyper fascist, like we need to restore the traditional family type thing. Theirs is, well, not even hyper fascist really. It's more like the right's position on it is just generically fascist, and where the left's is hyper fascist, in that the left is has a more universalist, almost metaphysical, with like the "let a thousand sexes bloom" thing, where they want to capture everything within this kind of within this social category of gender, like I was talking about before, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Trying to avoid sounding like a centrist or a leftist or a reactionary.
Yeah.
So it's difficult to
Oh,
describe things in that sense. But
definitely. Trust me, I know that struggle. I'm in the same struggle, I think. Okay, maybe if you agree that I've kind of understood well enough, and I think you've by now made yourself quite clear, and I think this has been quite productive and effective in exchange. Honestly, I mean, it's been really cool, because sometimes, these like complicated ideas, sometimes like these conversations, you can only get so far, and like, you still leave with like a lot of questions unanswered, and you're not really sure if you totally get it. But I actually feel like on this point, I understand your views on this way better than I did coming into this. So that's cool. Maybe I could give you a quick challenge. Like, I think what a lot of people listening to this might be thinking is kind of something like, your model is not implausible. It's certainly interesting, and you make good arguments, and you have some interesting data points as well. But there is a kind of alternative model, I think, that a lot of people might have in their minds, which I'd be curious if you could, respond to it. It's like, some people would say the increasing demands of techno capital is going to basically, how should I put this? It's like only the strong will survive, this kind of idea, right? And so you could argue, like, I think some people think that what's actually happening right now with like the cultural ascendance of like, kind of like mainstream feminism, and, these data points about like women doing better in school and this sort of stuff, like that this is actually, how do I put it? It's like the last like dying breath of humanism, of like the efforts of human beings to kind of like, maintain sophisticated symbolic cultures, and like moralistic, like communities, against the threats of techno capital. So there's like this like bunkering down and kind of intensification of the kind of maternal instincts, or something like that, the feminine instincts, to kind of make one last, push against the encroachments of techno capital, which seem to be like, at our door, threatening to decimate, the very possibility of humanity, or something like that. And so like what we're seeing is kind of like a last gasping breath of maybe like the maternal or feminine impulses, or values, or traits, or something. And mind you, I'm kind of mimicking what I think many people might say. I don't know how much I think this. And that actually what's going to happen, what we're actually also seeing right now, is a resurgence of the the need for strength, a resurgence of masculine values or traits or whatever, and that those will make those are kind of already making a comeback. And over the next like couple of decades, like those who are able to survive and breed and reproduce or whatever are going to be these like tight knit, strong, tough communities, probably presumably with like, you know, authoritarian kind of male like patriarchal structures and values. I think a lot of people think that, and there are, I don't know how much I think that, but there are certainly some data points for that. Like you see things like how like trendy and like martial arts has become, for instance, things like this. Like there is like, you definitely see in a lot of quarters, and this is very much like the Jordan Peterson phenomenon, right? Like you see a lot of data points about a lot of men kind of starting to get more like realizing that, you know, they've been soy boys or bug men for too long, and they want to get tough and they want to learn how to fight, and they want to be strong and responsible. You know, so there are as many data points kind of pointing in the other direction in the cultural trends right now. I think of also like, I don't know if you've ever seen these people, like I think it's called Operation Werewolf. I was only alerted to this recently, but it's kind of like a fascist pagan kind of like back to the land, strong masculine community type of project. I don't know much about them, but again, it's just another kind of data point. So yeah, like I wonder what you think about that. That basically a lot of people have a kind of opposite view of yours, which is that like weak women and trans people are going to be increasingly kind of sidelined by the brutality of techno-capitalism, and what will emerge is only like strong patriarchal communities. What do you think of that?
Yeah, this goes more into why I have the Lesbian RX component to, or component whatever, the follow up to GAC, because yeah, it would definitely seem like in a patchwork type scenario, like there's this really good pamphlet, I guess. I don't know if it's long enough to be considered not a pamphlet, but it's called Desert, and it's by this anonymous author. It's like a green anarchist, green nihilist piece talking about how climate change, talking about climate change and how like there's no way we're ever going to stop it. And so what does this mean for green anarchy? And part of that is talks about how climate change is going to start to produce these kind of like also what I guess Nick Land alludes to in Meltdown, like these kind of hot war zones where there's scarce resources and there's more of a either fighting against authoritarian regimes in like more localized senses, or like, you know, like in a Patrick scenario basically, or like more anarchic, almost barbarian uh geopolitical areas. So yeah, it's a really good point, and I think that in a lot of cases it's kind of true that especially in like any kind of collapse scenario, because you know I allude to patchwork all the time, especially in the case of Lesbian RX, because Lesbian RX builds off of patchwork as like a political technology to talk about what the future of feminist feminist movements is going to look like. And so part of that definitely includes this kind of like, there's going to be masculine, or there's going to be a kind of a reterritorialization of masculinity, and to like the point where it becomes even more rigidified. uh carcinization is what neo-reactionaries call that, I think.
Hmm.
So that being said, then it would seem maybe like that is that contradicts GIAC a little bit, but it's actually the opposite. I think that that's all great, because masculinity is fragile. Masculinity is rigid, static. It's easy to fracture, and I talk about this in GIAC, specifically talking about the free software movement. That um, man, I almost don't want to spoil it because it's so fucking good. But
Up to you. You don't have to. You can keep us in
well,
suspense if you want.
I think that I've alluded to it before, maybe, but I'm just gonna, I'm just gonna say it now, I guess. But
Okay.
so in the history of the free software movement, that kind of started around the MIT in the 60s and 70s. They're one of the first operating systems that was a time sharing system. Uh, so time sharing systems being basically that multiple people could be logged onto the system at once, and you didn't you people could share time on it. One of the first time sharing systems, one of the first that was widely used, especially, was a time sharing system called Multics. And Multics was one of several other time sharing systems to be made around this time. Uh, it came after a couple other ones, and Multics was well known back then in like the MIT hacker community for being a a very fragile, easy, like the security was easy to break. It was slow. It was like you had to pay per minute that you were using it or something stupid like that. It was very highly policed by the whatever bureaucracies it was that was in charge of it. I think it was like AT&T and Honeywell, and then MIT itself. And it was kind of considered like, this is the one way to program. And this is the future. This Multics thing. And eventually, let's see, trying to remember exactly how the story goes, but basically what ends up happening after this operating system Multics, it, people keep hacking it, breaking the security, just all around fucking around with it and doing everything that they could. All these programmers at MIT to stall the development of it and to get in the way of any progress in using it. And eventually, MIT and Bell Labs scraps the production of it in 1969. And the the new operating system that ends up replacing it is called Unix. And Unix was called such because Unix Unix is a phoneticization of eunuch, as in castrated.
Oh, really?
It's a castrated Multics is why they called it that.
Really?
So, and yeah, and so Unix is different from being Multics in that it was, or well, Unix, I don't think anybody still uses it because there are a bunch of other versions of it now. But basically, as opposed to Multics being a very like uh, kind of like a product of bureaucracy, being very rigid and very highly policed, and in a way almost you could say centralized, Unix was small, portable, very open, very easy to hack on. So what the reason why I bring all this up is because it gets to a broader point as far as like, isn't hypermasculinization going to happen? Isn't carcinization going to happen as a result of techno capital? And basically, yes, that's definitely happened many times in the history of speaking in terms of just computer science being, the major, you know, the one half of techno capital, obviously. Um, it's most certainly the case that that happens, but it always ends up losing to a fluid feminine um, mode of being, basically, because masculinity is too easy is too easy to break, and it's too hard for it to adapt to change. And to take a more recent example, frame it in terms of politics. And Sadie Plant talks about this in Zeros Plus Ones with talking about like Sun Tzu and Amazonian warfare. But this is also talked about by a military theorist, I guess you'd call him, John Robb. He wrote this book, Brave New War, about the war in Afghanistan, or not in Afghanistan. Sorry, the whole Middle Eastern conflict, all the
Mhm.
different conflicts, and how basically you can extend this just to neoliberalism as a whole, as like this one new world order system of doing things, where this one bureaucracy that's globalized across the whole world. But in the case of the Middle East, basically very lightly armed insurgents utilizing very, very cheap attacks, like literally just unloading a magazine into an oil pipeline, caused the United States, I think, millions and millions and millions of dollars in damage. And
Hmm.
this is an attack against like these oil pipelines. There are like hundreds of miles of these things and similar infrastructures like power lines that it's impossible for these centralized bureaucratic, phallic hyper masculine organizations or entities or whatever to police. So basically, what ends up happening is that the what ends up happening is the more carcinicized you end up getting, the more the more masculinity ends up getting accelerated, the easier it is to attack and destroy because it just can't keep up. It can't keep up with this lightweight fluid. Sadie Plant characterizes this type of warfare as feminine in zeros plus ones, and obviously I agree with her.
Okay.
That Yeah,
Yeah.
so hopefully that answers your question. That basically this is another part of Lesbian Neoreaction that I didn't get to before, but um, this I mentioned this war between the sexes type thing. That I think that the fallout of gender accelerationism is exactly what you're saying. That it's both of what you're saying. Like in terms of like your response to your response to my position in gender accelerationism, and also what you were agreeing with. It's both. That that on the one hand, there's obviously this kind of liberation of women that's happening, and there's more of a bloom of queerness in the world. But and then alongside that is a reaction against it, and that becomes more and more accelerated the more techno capital accelerates as a reaction against it, and it ends up creating the tension I was talking about in this war of the sexes. And basically, as far as like lesbian or X is concerned, this is great because it means that men are just setting themselves up for their own demise. The more that they try to react against it, and the more they try to we need to return to being masculine, and we need to like we need to return to traditional values and live traditional lives and all of that. The more
Uh-huh.
that they do that, the more easy they are to destroy.
So, okay, yeah, that's all super interesting, especially those stories about Unix. They're very fascinating. I mean, I think you make a really good case about how it seems like in many ways the acceleration of techno capitalism is making like all systems that are based on control increasingly brittle, basically. And if you think of control as associated with masculine or patriarchal, then I think your model is very plausible and quite, it's quite useful and interesting and quite provocative for like parsing many vexing data points.
It's important to point out here real quick too that the the uh, the powers that be, whatever, the CIA in the Vault 7 leaks from a while back, they themselves admit in there that yeah, we can't control this. There's no way for the government to control what is it? They called it like cyber war or something. Let me see if I can find it real quick.
Well, I had one specific
Actually, yeah, you can
question.
keep talking.
Yeah, no, I had one specific question I wanted to just get your opinion on. How does this convert to the patchwork model? Because you've mentioned this, and I know that you're interested in that. Like, is the idea that like in patchwork, a lesbian, like authoritarian lesbian sovereign corporation would be selected as like the optimal political model? Is that what you mean by like lesbian neo-reaction and patchwork?
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier meta neocameralism, the Nick Land's Xenosystem post, and I think that the way that I use patchwork when talking about lesbian RX might either confuse, or in the case of people who are into patchwork and neoreaction, might also anger people, because the way I use patchwork when talking about lesbian RX is very different from how patchwork is typically employed, except at least to my knowledge in the case of Nick Land's meta neocameralism, where he basically says that the wolves of the outside, in his the way he puts it, are going to viciously destroy anything in patchwork that isn't optimal for survival.
Mhm.
And I basically align lesbian RX with the outside. Like I was talking about before, how uh, Sadie Plant, and also Amy Ireland in Black Circuit, how they both talk about women in machines, women in AI having like a kind of common. Um, good, you found it.
Mhm.
How they kind of have a common. Um, I don't know if I'd say goal exactly, but there is at least a kinship amongst AI and women, and so sorry, I just got a notification that distracted me. So where
Yeah.
was I? So in the terms of patchwork and how lesbian RX fits into that, I basically align lesbian RX with the outside, with anarchy, and again, drawing on some other sources for this. Especially in the case of like Neo-Amazonia, the idea of a Neo-Amazonian patchwork
Hmm.
in Greek mythology, or I think it's mythology, whatever. Greek mythology slash historical sources. The Amazons were never characterized as really having their own like strictly speaking, society or city state or something. They were always kind of presented as being on the fringes or of civilization, right on the edge of like civilization and complete like inhuman chaos,
Hmm.
the inhuman chaos of the natural world, which again kind of falls in line with what I've been talking about as or alluding to with like women as being as women and chaos, the primordial feminine chaos that people like Jordan Peterson talk about. But it's far from just being Jordan Peterson though. It's pretty much in the entire history of Western and Eastern thought. Chaos has always been identified with woman, and order has always been identified with masculine. You see this in both the yin yang and also in the Kabbalah. Um, so basically, as far as patchwork works into this, it's really more that lesbian RX is like an anti-patchwork. It's the anti-patchwork to the masculine patchwork,
Hmm.
where there's masculine sovereign corporation city states. For lesbian RX, it's a distributed anti-patch, a kind of like a free market anarchist type society that.
Okay. Okay. That's really interesting to me because I don't know how much you followed like stuff I've been talking about recently, but like in my podcast with Uriello, for instance, and also in my podcast with Nick, which will come out soon, hopefully. I've been thinking a lot about like the communist patch, like how like if there's any possibility of a legitimate and serious left accelerationism, it would have to be engineered as you'd have to kind of show how you could engineer a functional communist patch. So it sounds like what you just described, like is it fair to say, would you say that the feminist anti-patch, the distributed anti-patch softcorp would be also like a more egalitarian model? Is that fair to say? Is communist even?
I'm not exactly sure if I would say it's egalitarian or not, because I'm very like this is the part of like the neo reaction side of it that
Okay.
I'm very on board with with like the kind of exclusionary anti-universalism of neo reaction. So I wouldn't necessarily say that it's just going to be like a great egalitarian communist type thing.
Right.
Um, there because obviously at the very least cishet men are going to be excluded violently. So,
Necess-
but
okay. Necessarily, like what if they're like compliant?
I'm kind of joking with that. I
Yeah.
mean, it's it's more like it's more like there's going to be either a degree of separation, like kind of this kind of like has a history also in the idea of like lesbian separatism and radical feminism. except for lesbian separatism, it was always that all women should become lesbians and become separatists from patriarchy because that's their political duty or whatever. Whereas for me, I don't really give a shit if straight women or straight women, be they trans or cis, if they aren't on board with this. Like I say many times, then they can just die with all of the men too, for all I care, if that's what they choose. So I would say that basically, though, that lesbian RX is not necessarily fully like egalitarian and communist and all that, in the sense that it's explicitly aligned with the war and explicitly exclusionary. But on the other hand, like you said earlier about lesbian RX, if it's like an authoritarian lesbian patch type thing,
Mhm.
and I think that this is like I mean, I really think that this is the core of patchwork that people don't recognize because it's always being upheld by people like Moldbug, who have like an extremely iron-fisted authoritarian ideology that obviously, as an anarchist, I find it absolutely repugnant. So why am I into patchwork? And I think that patchwork is necessarily pluralist, and that I mean I don't just think it is. I mean it is necessarily pluralist. That there's going to be many different patches that will form, and they're all going to compete with each other in one way or another. So I think that it would the lesbian RX anti patch would very much coexist, or could coexist, with like communist egalitarian and other queer patches in an egalitarian sense, but
Okay.
while maintaining a healthy degree of exclusion and autonomy that's defined by the members of said patches. And as far as like the communist part of it goes, I think that I'm very much I'm very much in agreement with Kevin Carson, the anarchist theorist writer guy, that market anarchism of a non-ANCAP variety, so like mutualism and agorism, basically, necessarily results in communism to a large extent, because if you don't have a state enforcing intellectual property, and not just intellectual property but also essentially monopolies on various industries, that things that most of the commodities that we need, well, especially the ones that we need, are going to become so readily available and so cheap to produce that we'll effectively have communism for them anyway. But on the other hand, I think that mutualism and agorism is superior to a like, I don't know. I'd be curious to know what your thoughts are as far as how communist patches would form, because what immediately comes to my mind is anarcho-communism, from you know my background as an anarchist, my currently being an anarchist of some very weird sort. Um, uh, and I know a decent amount of anarcho-communism, which is why I've went in the direction that I have towards being post-left and market anarchist. And like the biggest objection for me, basically, with like an anarcho-communist patch, is that I think it would not work out, because we haven't reached communism yet. Like, we haven't reached full communism, and even if we abolished capitalism, in the sense of even if like patchwork happened and there was no like federal government policing everything, policing intellectual property, and maintaining maintaining the monopolies that various corporations have over industries. I still don't think that we would be at a point of full communism. I think that we would, for many resources, have effectively have communism, but for Marx, communism is not just that. Communism is basically a state of post-scarcity, as I understand it. I mean, you probably know a lot more about Marx than I do, but
Well, no, I'm sure that I don't, but and I don't have like a fully worked out model of how the communist patch would work, and um, also I don't want to take us too far afield, so I won't go on like a really long rant on how I see that. But thank you for asking, and I'm happy to share a little bit about my thinking, because I actually think it links up quite nicely with a lot of the stuff you're talking about. I think like your lesbian neo-reactionary vision might actually be quite consistent with or might overlap with my kind of communist leaning vision in ways that I think we'll just have to work out over time, but I think it's quite promising. I mean, I'll just say briefly that I guess to me, the reason why communism never works and never has worked, and to the degree I'm a communist, I'm definitely like of the more anarchist variety of communists.
Yeah, I gathered that.
Yeah, but honestly, to be honest, like these categories are so unwieldy nowadays. Like, you know, as someone who like professes lesbian neoreaction, I'm sure you can sympathize. I'm sure you can sympathize with like, you know, we're struggling to use these like really traditional terms to make shorthand, you know, slogans for like complex things we're trying to figure out. So I'm sure you get that. But so I mean, I'm hardly a communist or an anarchist really, but roughly, I mean, these are words that do evoke some things that I'm still kind of interested in. And I would say just that the reason why the dream of communism has always failed, in my view, it's mostly, you know, like coordination problems really and trust problems. And those historically have been insoluble. And so historically, like whenever people try to do communism, it usually like what happens is lying tends to be used as like a substitute for trying to paper over the trust issues and trying to paper over the coordination problems. And I guess, like I said, I don't pretend to have fully worked out, but my feeling is, my sense or intuition is that the acceleration of techno-capitalism and things like the decreasing cost of things that we're observing with, you know, like technological, you know, the prices of technology and things like this like approaching of zero of the cost of many things, such as software or whatever, is one phenomenon that I think is one component of a game changer. I think also, like social technologies. So, for instance, like the notion of patchwork or like as these forms get developed, you know, that could also be a game changer, just like, you know, the joint stock corporation or double entry bookkeeping was a game changer for the takeoff of modern capitalism into this like totally different historical plane. I mean, I think that for many reasons, there might be a few different vectors that are converging right now to introduce at least the possibility of a totally different engineering plane for like what types of social forms are possible. So yeah, like decreasing costs of things, the near universal digitalization of like most phenomena, and right, new forms such as like actually hammering out like the architecture of patchwork or something like that. And then finally, I think that we're making certain like social psychological discoveries or insights that like we've never really made before, to be honest, like as a species. And I don't want to start sounding all humanist, like we're gonna like solve, you know, the problems of the species and carry on triumphantly through the techno-capitalist atrocities. But like I'm not at all very optimistic about that. I'm more interested in like the medium term, like how to have the best possible human experience over the next like 100 years, you know, like and I think that we are at a point where we understand more about how humans work than ever. Like we're able to actually understand our inner mechanisms with a greater sophistication than ever. And I don't just mean that in the techno kind of transhumanist sense, like we're able to physically and like hack ourselves, although that's an interesting and promising component of it or a possibility. I actually mean more in terms of our knowledge of how our processes work, you know, so like, especially for those of us who are kind of into the whole like Deleuze, Spinoza, Nietzsche kind of lineage, you know, like it's very fascinating to me how like very contemporary neuroscience, for instance, is like vindicating Spinoza's intuitions, you know, things like this. And I think like the increasing availability of scientific experimentation capacity, you know, like large scale data collection efforts, a large scale computer, you know, networking projects that are, and I know you're interested in this too, that can be done in small groups, like quite affordably and quite powerfully. Basically, these are all data points or vectors I'm citing as reasons that I believe, you know, the historical coordination problems and the historical trust problems that I think have been the real major roadblock for the communist vision. I'm not at all convinced that those coordination and trust problems cannot possibly be solved basically by these vectors I'm citing. And so yeah, my vision is like I think that you actually could imagine cleverly kind of rewiring, our psychology, rewiring our formal relationships, rewiring our informal relationships, in ways that basically solve the trust and coordination problems. And I'll just leave it at that because it's very. I'd have to think more about exactly how to convince people of how that would all work. But that's a short statement of what I'm seeing.
Yeah, and this is also my interview, not yours.
Sorry.
No, I'm just joking. Yeah, I think that it's hard to talk about where I stand on on something like communism, for instance, in a way that's going to make sense to a lot of people. I think because like I definitely agree with a lot of what you're saying, especially as far as like the possibilities for communication go, with technology, especially with open source technology or free software. Like it's becoming increasingly easier and increasingly there's become more of a network effect out there where people are getting tired of stuff of the Facebook, Google, Apple oligarchy that's basically in place, or oligopoly, and are moving towards completely decentralized alternatives. Like we're basically seeing a like renaissance in the internet for decentralization, where the original aim of the internet was to be completely decentralized, and we've seen a re-centralization happen. And that's kind of, now it's becoming decentralized again with stuff like, well, not specifically Bitcoin. Bitcoin is like the most well known of them, but Bitcoin has its own problems as far as re-centralization goes. But as far as cryptocurrencies go, as far as free software goes, and free software alternatives for social networking, like Mastodon and Matrix, um, Holochain, and its opportunities for both decentralized exchange of currencies and also decentralized hosting and sharing of data. Uh, I guess, and it's hard to really situate myself in all of this because on the one hand, being a post leftist, I have a lot of disdain for the left, and I'm very critical of it because I think that most of it is essentially just like you were talking about how communism has failed because of trust issues. There's this um one anarchist writer uh on Twitter who mentioned this once, that the problem with anarcho-communists is that they're always trying to basically posture and get more social clout in like in their collectives. And so it's interesting you bring that up, and I guess the response I have to like that specifically is we we may be reaching a point where it's easier to circumvent these problems with trust. But then on the other hand, the market already provides a trustless system for doing things. Uh, but
Right.
then,
Well, but is that, yeah, I mean, you can think about that in two ways. Like you can think of that as the like trustless is a very fascinating concept because you could think of that as the, obsolescence of trust, or you could think about it as the perfection of trust, So yeah,
yeah,
it's
that's true.
interesting.
I mean, it's kind of like both things are just near converging at the same point through through different through either, I guess, culture and community type stuff in the case of communism versus the economics and technology of, on the other hand, of like more market based stuff.
Right.
And
Right.
yeah, it's kind of hard to talk about also because on the one hand, I like a lot of my influences with my the views that I've put forward and am working on and have attempted to put forward are influenced by Marx, which might be surprising for being an anarchist, and especially by Nihilist Communism, which was a book by this uh, Marxist. I guess you could maybe describe him as a left com. Although I'm sure he wouldn't appreciate that. But he this communist. Monsieur Dupont wrote. I don't know. I don't even know if that's the right way to pronounce it, but he wrote this book, Nihilist Communism, that is basically was a big influence on my cyber nihilism series. I don't know if you are familiar with that at all, but
A little bit. I don't recall too much, but yeah.
well, basically, it was a big influence on me because it was one of the first things I read that really made me realize that there's no way to achieve communism without accelerating capital. Basically, that
Mhm.
capitalism is not going to just collapse because you want it to, or because you raise enough consciousness to somehow just force it to stop existing. Like it's going to continue until production has made capitalism obsolete. If production is until our production power is so much that capitalism is an obsolete system for managing our resources.
Hmm.
Um,
Mhm.
but I think we've maybe gone a little off topic as far as lesbian or X and GAT goes. I
That's
forget if
right.
we had anything. Oh, there was actually one other thing on that topic that I just remembered.
Yeah.
As far as the question of egalitarianism and communism in lesbian or X, and part of it has to do with and actually Crypt asked a question earlier
I
about
was gonna get to that. I was gonna ask if you wanted to talk to that.
yeah, we can. I don't remember exactly what the question was, but what I'm about to say will dovetail right into it. So
Okay.
I'll just say
Cool.
my thing, and then we can go from there. But as far as the egalitarianism or lack thereof, or whatever, or a little bit of both of lesbian or X goes,
Hmm.
this goes back to a lot of tweets that I've made that are both that are both jokes, but also I'm being serious about when I talk about validity discourse and how much I hate validity discourse. Um, like in queer circles, especially in trans circles, just this extremely universalist kind of theoretical understanding of gender where everybody's just always talked about in terms of, oh, you're valid, you're all valid, anything you any any way you feel about your gender or sexuality is just valid, and that goes directly into the type of gender accelerationism or whatever you want to call it that I was uh, um, distinguishing myself from earlier.
Okay.
uh, the let a thousand sexes bloom type, where on the one hand I don't care if people want to whatever people want to identify as, because ultimately your personal gender identification doesn't even matter in like a social context, is what I feel. um and so on the one hand you can identify as whatever you want, and if anybody tries to police that, then you should use any means necessary to stop it, because that's really gross and unnecessary and fascist and bad. But on the other hand, as far as my theoretical positions goes, and to some extent my personal prejudices that I will never make public because there's no need to. It's just kind of abusive to do it. Um, is that not everybody is valid. Gender has a basis to at least some extent in quote unquote real biological stuff, like coming from like a radical feminist position. Gender to the very least, even if it's even though gender itself is like a social construct or whatever. um I mean, my opinions on that are more complicated also, but we'll get into that in a minute when we address the thing Crip brought up. But
Okay.
to whatever extent gender is a social construct, it still originates in something that is like hard scientific biological, which is sex, and the kind of the primordial power opposition, or I'm trying to think of like the right way to put it, but basically like the primordial kind of power structure between male and female, where, like I mentioned earlier, as far as like for the sake of continuing the species goes, women have a biological duty to reproduce, and that essentially makes them subordinated to men in a way, because pregnancy makes women more vulnerable to men, and it makes there has to be like special care taken to make sure that women have a safe pregnancy and don't die, especially before modern medicine.
Mhm.
It was really very common for women to die in childbirth. um
Mhm.
so that pretty much forces women into a position where they have to bide their time until and kind of play at the history of the human race in a way where they're ultimately going to win. Like Sadie Plant talks about this in Zeros Plus Ones, how I think it's she's talking about peacocks in it, how it would seem that peacocks evolved to have like male peacocks evolved to have more feathers to attract a female mate, but in a lot of cases with peacocks or other animals, like the males are evolved in a way that makes their survival less likely. Like peacocks, for instance, having bright feathers and having very bright and ornate feathers makes you an easier for predators to see you. You don't have any camouflage. And my personal favorite example of this is anglerfish. The black sea devil, or actually, I think the black sea devil might not have this specific dimorphism, but in a lot of deep sea anglerfish, um, there's a very very pronounced gender dimorphism where the male is like a tiny little thing that it's that it basically its whole the whole reason it exists is to find a female mate that it then fuses itself to, and provides the sperm for the female to reproduce. Um, so basically, though, it's for Sadie Plant. In a lot of cases, it seems that the male is less adapted to survive, and it's actually the way it works as far as evolution goes, and how this ultimately works out for females and for women, is that masculinity is kind of like a heat sink of sorts to test how well adapted genes are, and so it, males intentionally are less fit to survive in a lot of cases, because that ensures that it makes it harder for them to survive, and that only the strongest ones will survive to pass on their genes. So that's what I'm kind of alluding to as far as like the long con that women have to partake in order to win out against men, and
Okay.
being advantaged
Okay. Well,
biologically.
so
Sorry, I know that was
no,
really
no,
long.
no, you don't have to apologize at all. It's great. Just so okay. So there's a lot there. I mean, I guess we could. I guess I want to kind of just sort of channel what you were saying into a little bit more directly into Crip's question. What he raised a few questions, but I pulled them up and I'm looking at them. So like the first one was just whether or not you think that there's a biological etiology to transgenderism or transsexuality. And it sounds like, if I'm hearing you correctly, you are not at all, concerned or afraid of admitting like certain biological phenomena behind like the transsexual or transgender um, like process. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think that as again talking about like validity discourse and whatnot.
Yes, you
Um,
gave a good preface saying that like everyone should be able to do whatever they want and say describe themselves however they feel, and if someone is trying to impose something otherwise, that's fucked up and should be stopped. I think you were very clear on that, and I agree 100%.
yeah,
But yeah,
I'm mostly bringing that up again because I also mentioned how there's both a kind of political, moral, whatever side to it, of like validity discourse is fine in that capacity, obviously, and then on the other hand, there's a theoretical background to that, of like, do you actually believe that everybody is valid, or do you just say everybody is valid because it's the best way? It's because it's the most I don't know, the most compassionate way to uh, to uh, to treat other people, and also just makes the most sense. Um, and I Yeah, so I definitely think that and this kind of goes back to what I said earlier, that I've ignored most mainstream feminist thought, and maybe it maybe has contributed towards my opinion on this, but even though my brand or whatever is being kind of like radical feminism plus accelerationism, yeah. In a
Mhm.
lot of cases, uh, I feel like I feel like most feminist theory very bad. That either that either you have second wave type feminism that often can result in turfism and trans exclusionary feminism, where it says, where they say that gender is a social construct and therefore doesn't exist at all, and the only thing that matters is sex. So therefore, if you don't have a uterus, then you're not a woman, because woman is only being the female sex and nothing else. Or then on the other hand, you have third wave validity discourse type people that are of the opinion that everybody is valid and that biological sex doesn't really have anything to do with it, at least not in any significant way. And for me, I think it's a little bit of both. And in that you biological sex is important for reasons that I described previously. That biological sex is what creates these power disparities in the first place, and ultimately creates the social construct of gender. And gender itself is, I think I've said this several times, but I think it's way more useful to talk about gender as a hyperstition. That gender is not real, but gender makes itself real because and gender makes itself real starting in this in biological sex that it's based off of. So as far as like, I think hopefully that gets towards answering the question, but
For sure.
as
Oh,
far as like as far as trans people go, and whether there's like a kind of neurological, I don't know exactly, I don't remember exactly how Cripps said it. I don't have my Twitter in front of me because
yeah, that's okay.
don't, I've never mentioned this on Twitter, I don't think, because I'm super paranoid about it. But when I got banned from my old account, I basically um I now only use Twitter through through a VPN and through a
Hmm.
browser that has no fingerprint,
Oh,
so that
really?
Twitter can't like be like, oh, this is somebody who's circumventing a ban, because I don't know what they use to do that. Just like,
Are you circumventing a ban?
yeah, my old account got banned. The real
Nick's
Nick
land,
Land.
Nick's land on life.
No, my old one at real Nick Land.
Oh, right. So that one's is done.
Yeah, it got. I
Right.
don't know. Yeah, I don't know if you had known about that, because you follow a ton of people on Twitter, I'm realizing. But yeah, my old account got banned, and that's sorry. I mean, that was just a little aside that I thought was kind of
No,
that I
that's
just thought.
interesting. I was curious about that. So you think that like you logging into your current Twitter account, you think Twitter has a way of watching that and connect like you think they kind of penalize you on the back end for that?
Well, I know that Twitter will track people to determine if they're circumventing a ban by possibly using IP address based bans, but also maybe using browser fingerprinting. I don't know if it's that, if they have to what extent they do that, because all of Twitter's software is closed source, so nobody can know. But yeah, I was just saying that because I don't have Cripps tweet in front of me right now.
Oh, okay.
But yeah,
Yeah.
but,
Well, I actually do. But I mean, we don't need to like pick it apart and answer every single detail. But I think it's good to just try to respond to the spirit of, because it's cool when people give like really thoughtful, specific questions. So we should try to entertain them.
well, I
I
was
mean,
just thinking specifically about what the term was that how in what terms he put it, as far as like if being trans is based in any
the
neurological or whatever.
the first question he asked was the biological etiology to transsexuality, and I'm pretty sure, in a non-technical sense, that means like the driver of it, like the causes of it, basically. So, in other words, like what makes someone decide to transition, for instance? Like, do you agree with the literatures that suggest there is a significant biological determination of that, a biological causality to that trigger to decide to transition, or however you want to interpret that? Like, do you think there are, like, basically, in other words, like, non-agential causes, just like a biological process? Or do you think, or I guess on the opposite end would be, that it's like purely performative, like a Judith Butler kind of view, that it's just completely up to the, creative performative activity of the agent or something like that? Not to like, straw man Judith Butler or anything like that, but that would be, I think, like the opposite viewpoint.
Right. I Sorry, I just got another notification. I was checking real quick.
That's okay. I mean, you also might just not have strong opinions on this, and like, I don't want you to think like, as a trans person, you have to like answer this or something. Like, I mean, it's
Oh
all like,
no,
yeah,
I definitely want to answer it.
cool.
So the I the thoughts that I've had on this before, which may or may not be a very kind of rigorous way of thinking about these things, because I don't have any kind of background in I don't have any kind of background in like psychology or neurology type stuff. I mean, I majored in philosophy, and I know some stuff about computer science, and that's so. But that being said, I think that to whatever extent there's any kind of biological basis for being trans, it it's a combination, like I said, of the biological and also social components. That, on the one hand, I think that there are maybe traits about people, be they personality or otherwise, that are not in and of themselves feminine necessarily, but that get gendered as secondarily as feminine depending on the culture you live in. Because I mean,
Okay.
to a large extent, I think that there's a more or less universal kind of experience of gender, as far as like, if you share the same gender as somebody, then it's going to be mostly the same throughout cultures and throughout history, but not entirely, because there are different times in history where gender norms have been different in just the West, and then also in other non-Western societies there have been differences in gender norms and gender roles. But that being said, I think that I think that there is to some extent a basis in, like, if you are, for lack of a better term, if you're born a certain way, then you're just going to end up secondarily identifying um, with femininity or masculinity or whatever, or a combination of the two, or something else maybe.
Okay.
Um, and I think that that's also an interesting point to bring up in regards to gender accelerationism, because, as I was talking about before, I think that like, you could say maybe that to some extent it seems like there's more trans people these days because there's just more visibility for them, and I think that's very true to a great extent. But then I also think that that basically that being trans is a product of futurity, specifically, at least in gender accelerationism, that being a trans woman is a product of futurity. Because, like I was saying, I think that there are a lot of factors, both environmentally, with changes in the Earth's climate, and changes in the environments that humans live in, that contribute towards feminizing people, or at least making them imminently, like, more predisposed to femininity,
Okay.
which I think is something that has probably happened over many generations, alongside civilization.
Okay.
Um,
So you do think that there's a kind of increase in the prevalence of transgenderism, which is caused by social, economic, technological factors?
yeah, specifically trans femininity.
So that's fascinating, and I think that's like a perfectly plausible. I think it's like an open question, is the way I see it personally. I mean, I guess if I could kind of respond a little bit to Crip's question also, I mean, I would say that I'm not a sex expert by any means. I'm not a biologist. I'm a social scientist, but really not that kind of. I'm not even really a proper like psychologist. But I do.
It's a good thing that you're married, because saying on stream that you're not a sex expert is a bad look.
Sick burn.
Anyway,
I mean,
go on.
my wife would probably also tell you I'm not a sex expert, but although I don't know, maybe she would say otherwise. Someone will have to ask her at some point. Anyway, yeah, like the way. So I was giving a preface that I'm not at all like an expert on this stuff, but I read, you were saying before that you keep getting asked questions about Ray Blanchard, and I have a hypothesis as to why that is. It might be because Alice Dreger's book, I think, has gotten a lot of attention recently, and it's quite a good book. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but she was
I'm not.
Yeah, so basically, she was an academic, and she basically wrote this book about a bunch of cases of very interesting and profound instances where basically like social activists came into conflict with scientific research of different kinds. And so she does a few different case studies of basically about how messy this gets, and how it's basically all these stories and data about how activism and kind of moralism and different types of like cultural entrepreneurs like really aggressively try to kind of like paper over and like the findings of science basically, and like go on harassment campaigns against scientific researchers to discredit them and spread all kinds of like disinformation. And it's a pretty profound set of stories. Like it goes pretty deep, and I think it's quite a good book. So I'm recommending it as a book generally. But one of the cases is the case of Michael Bailey in particular. I don't know if you know his book, The Man Who Would Be Queen. It's basically in the tradition of the Ray Blanchard work. He studies, basically the causes of transgenderism or transsexuality, and basically, so yeah, for people who are listening, by the way, who like don't know what we're talking about, so just very briefly, their model is basically that there are primarily two forms of transgenderism, or two like types of cases of transgenderism, two fundamental different types of reasons why people become trans. And one is, it was mentioned before in the comments, autogynephilia, which is basically it's basically like a kink. It's like a sexual fetish. It's a desire. People get turned on. Like if a man, specifically we're talking about male to female trans, like that some men get really turned on by the idea of being a woman, and they pursue transgenderism for that route. And mind you, like if any of this sounds problematic, like I'm pretty sure like even Michael Bailey and like Ray Blanchard are pretty, like they're not like I actually don't, from what I got from Alice Dreger's book, they're not actually like transphobic or anti-trans. Maybe they might have been insensitive or said some fucked up shit here and there or whatever. But as far as I know, they both say that like these are perfectly fine reasons to transition, and they're not like trying to discredit or invalidate anything, just as a caveat. Anyway, the basic idea is that sexuality. And specifically, it tends to be cases of like what we might call quote unquote twinkish gay men who basically pursue transitioning gender as a kind of adaptive strategy for basically like circumventing like the harsh patriarchal, suppression or repression or whatever, or punishment of homosexuality. So they do all this research, and according to the empirical data that they all gather, those are basically overwhelmingly like the two. They explain that those two possible types explain most of the available data on like why some people transition and why some people don't. As I said, I'm not an expert. I don't know exactly the depths of like how true or false that is. But as far as I could tell, I mean, I think, it's like, I think that's fairly consistent with at least a good amount of the data. I guess where I come down on that is like, I don't actually think that that's like too problematic. Like, I don't think that like normatively or ethically, like, I don't think it's that horrifying to identify that there are biological processes that account for some, and even maybe a good number of maybe even most cases of transgenderism, and to also say, like what you said, Nick's, like if someone says that they're trans, if someone says they're a man, if someone says they're a woman, like then that's just that you respect that. Like it's just an asshole, like repressive move to say anything else or to try to do anything else in response to that. So I think it's like, as long as you affirm that, then like the scientific data, the Blanchard model, like I think it's like plausible as far as it goes, and I don't think it's that problematic personally. I don't know if you want to respond to any of that, but
yeah, I find it really interesting. In part I find it really interesting because it would seem like the social activists who want to repress that are basically then saying it's not legitimate to transition if you have AGP, assuming it's real.
right.
Like if you, or whatever, if you, it's not legitimate to transition if you are, if you're doing it for, I don't even know how that would work as a kink thing to permanently change your body. Like, are you just going to be horny all the time then? I don't know. But but assuming that this has any scientific merit, or any merit even in terms of like kind of critical theory queer feminist stuff.
Mhm.
um yeah, it's interesting to me that that's considered not a legitimate reason. But then uh on the other hand, it's also not clear to me what the opposing view to it is that's at least a coherent one. Like if it's not AGP, if AGP is not a legitimate reason to transition, then what is it that makes you a quote unquote real woman, or whatever, quote, whatever your gender is? I mean, obviously, I'm going to use woman as the default for being, because I'm trans and whatever. But so what is there? What is legitimate as far as being a real woman is concerned, and for like the bulk of queer and feminist theory and culture activism type stuff, the narrative is that you're born that way, and that for whatever reason there's like a that's just inherently how you are. And if that's inherently how you are, that you're just inherently trans, then wouldn't that also be saying that there's some kind of neurological basis for being trans, if you're not on board with the idea that AGP is legitimate? And then if that's not your opinion either, then you fall into this, like, you just fall into this black hole of validity discourse that doesn't have any strong kind of critical weight to it at all. And then ultimately, I think what you fall into is what is like the truest realization of this is gender nihilism, which is
Hmm.
a very niche position in like queer theory that basically, as far as I understand it, is it's kind of like the idea that gender doesn't real, so we should just not perform gender or not believe in gender or something like that.
Hmm.
Which, I mean, on the one hand, it appeals to me for being somebody who's interested in nihilism and has identified themselves as a nihilist in many cases. But then on the other hand, it seems to me like almost a passive nihilism in like a Nietzschean sense, where it's just like, no, gender isn't real. We should just ignore it. Ignore gender discourse altogether. That's at least what that line of thought seems to ultimately fall out into. So then, looking at it from like the other side, that maybe AGP is legitimate, is it's very interesting to me, because first of all, I don't understand why so many people ignore this, but it's not. But sexuality is a lot more complicated in humans than this discourse makes it out to be. Like, it's like I was saying earlier, if you have AGP and you transition, that are you not a trans woman if you aren't horny, or are you just all the time, are you turned on all the time now if you transition to a trans woman and you have AGP? Like, how does that even work? And I
Right.
think and I think that as far as like any kind of connection between sexuality and gender, specifically being trans, goes, it's more that in general, sexuality is wrapped up with human interaction and uh, even our own personal psychology and experiences of the world and our emotions in very complicated ways. So like um like a good example of this that has been pointed out before for people like asking about AGP, and like, oh well, am I really trans if I have ever gotten turned on at the idea of being a woman? And it's like it's it there are lots of cases, at least in males. Obviously, I wouldn't know how this works with people who were assigned to female at birth. Um, but at least as far as males go, there are a lot of cases where there will be like arousal, or at least like things that like becoming erect or whatever that are associated with that are not in sexual contexts.
Hmm.
So how do you explain that if you're submitting to this view that
Right.
sexuality is a simple one if you're turned on, then you have a fetish for something or what have you.
Right. I think also like the easiest and most obvious sort of counter argument or addition to that, to the Blanchard model, is just that there is also maybe another type of case that's less common maybe, but legitimate just as well, which is perhaps the one that you're referring to with your kind of like cultural influence model, which is there is like a new type or a new vector in which perhaps like individuals are leaning towards gender transitioning for new types of reasons. Like that's a perfectly plausible, and it's perfectly an open empirical question. And I mean, I think there's some data for that too, because like you see, I mean, definitely it seems very clear to me that like queerness in a broader sense is like way more popular now. Like you see way more like normal people like experimenting with like queer presentation. So like it's plausible to me that within that kind of vector there is like a non-trivial number of people who are like yeah, basically like transgender for like purely autonomous, like creative, personal, you know, uh, personal performative, creative reasons or something like that. Like I don't think I don't think anything about the Blanchard model says there can't be like significant cases of that. I don't know.
Yeah, that's actually that's kind of like funny that you brought that up, because I was actually just the other day. I mean, that just made me think about this as far as like how things have changed culturally. But the other day um was watching Red Letter Media, and they were doing a best of the worst episode on this Christian propaganda thing, basically from like the 90s, on how the internet is bad because of porn. And there was like a section in it where the speaker very casually mentioned how the gay lifestyle, and how uh, people are being recruited into the gay lifestyle by the internet, and how it has to be stopped because it's bad. And it was very very funny to me to see that, because
Again, you're like, yeah, and that's a good thing.
yeah, exactly. It's great that it's great that the internet is amplifying sexuality and recruiting people into being gay or whatever. But yeah, it's really interesting, I guess, how in just 20 years how strongly things have changed. We're now we're now like, even like in most Christian settings, except for like in the deep South probably, being Christian and saying that being gay is a sin or something is pretty not accepted at all. At least for like cis gay people, especially cis gay men. I mean, for like trans people, there's a whole different dimension to it and this isn't just with trans people. It's like I was just talking today with my partner about something related to body modifications in the body modification community, and apparently there's some kind of controversy going on now with that, where people in the body modification community who do body modifications are getting attacked by journalists, basically, and also by like some kind of like health organizations or something. And you also see this type of thing with a couple years ago when Google Glass first came out and people were getting attacked for wearing Google Glass in the streets. That there's like a whole different dimension to being trans, where people are really uncomfortable and scared at the idea of people changing their bodies in like a way that they choose to, with like some like agency involved. um so that's like I guess I don't know, it's interesting to point that out in relation to what you were just saying with AGP and Blanchard, that there might be another mode of being trans that's emerging alongside it being both more culturally represented and accepted to perform different kind of modes of sexuality and gender expression that aren't based in any kind of biological determinism or like reproductive futurism. And then also just having the freedom to like having more freedom to do such things, even in the 90s it was really hard for trans people to get access to hormones. um, and most of the time it was expected that if you were going to transition, you had to get SRS, sexual reassignment surgery, or you were not legitimate. But anyway, yeah, bringing it back to AGP though, I don't know if it's been brought up yet, but as far how I've always seen AGP described also, because you mentioned how for I think you said this was for Blanchard, but also was just a common view at the time that trans women were basically just extremely homosexual men. And
Well, that's another type, is what they argue. It's a separate like pathway for
yeah,
transgenderism. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. At least as far as like what we today call straight trans women. Back then they would call it homosexual trans women, because they're both because there's a man and a quote unquote man, if you're a straight trans woman back then.
Right.
But yeah, it's so basic. But yeah, so basically, the belief back then would be that trans women are are even not really legitimate necessarily, but just that trans women who are straight are just extremely heterosexual men, and then women who are AGP, or trans women who are AGP, are oh, sorry, I said extremely heterosexual. I meant homosexual a second ago. I misspoke. But but then trans women who have AGP are straight men who get off on the idea of being a woman, supposedly, and these types of trans women are trans women that we would today call queer, because they are trans women that are into the idea of like being a woman and being with a woman. I think is also how that works is
Right.
with AGP,
It
which
is
obviously is
strange.
interesting to me, being not since I'm not straight. So AGP would, in Blanchard's view, I guess, apply to me. Um, yeah, I don't know. We've talked a lot about AGP. I've kind of I'm not sure exactly where to go from there.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think we've covered so much ground. This has been really awesome and interesting in so many ways. I think we covered all of the components of Crip's question as well as we could have hoped to. To be honest with you, I mean, we've been talking for so long now. I'm like pretty fried. It's for me, it's 11:48 at night, and I'm coming up, since I started at 9. I'm coming up on 3 hours now, so I'm starting to be a bit fried. But if you have the brain power, maybe I could ask you just one more question, which comes from the audience. Are you cool with that?
Yeah.
So Lee wants me to ask you about the increase in DIY cutter culture and exotic genital mods component and its growing black market, and how does that comport with your paradigm? And Lee adds that they started as a eunuch, then moved to trans femme.
That's really interesting. You know, I honestly haven't even considered that point, that dimension to it, because I mean, I mentioned body modification a couple minutes ago. Personally, I'm not a part of the body modification community or anything like that. I mean, at some point, I want to get some like piercings in my face and stuff, but I can't do that yet. But otherwise, I'm not really involved in that community, so it's not even something I thought of. But you know, I think that Sadie Plant mentions this a little bit in Zeros Plus Ones. I mean, she's specifically talking just about trans people, and but she also, or no, actually, she's not even specifically talking about trans people. She mentions body modification in that that section of it. You know, I probably wouldn't be able to find it, but I probably wouldn't be able to find it right now. But yeah, I think that I think that the body modification community, and specifically stuff that's related to like things that are gendered, uh, extreme genital body modification, or other stuff that's gendered, um, is on in part might relate to, in part it might relate to what I was talking about earlier, as far as like the "Let a Thousand Sexes Bloom" thing that I mentioned. Like, I think that I think maybe I should clarify that a little bit too. That I think that "Let a Thousand Sexes Bloom" is not revolutionary, not going to be the thrust of history as far as this war between the sexes I've alluded to many times goes. But I do think it's something that likely will happen. I think that, like you were mentioning, how you're mentioning how it's becoming increasingly more accepted for even like cis, quote unquote het people to experiment with like their sexuality and gender expression. um I mean, to be fair, in a lot of cases, at least as far as it goes with men, I think that it's kind of comic toxic masculinity, like where you have people who are like, these straight men have sex with each other, but they're still straight, type. Like I've seen many articles like that, and I'm just like, roll my eyes and like, you're not straight, just accept it.
Yeah.
But I think that maybe it's especially interesting to me that it's like an illegal underground kind of this body modification community is an illegal underground thing. Or maybe, I don't know if it's illegal, but it's at least underground and black market. Obviously, that interests me as somebody who's into market anarchism and agorism, because you know, agorism is the idea that market anarchist tactic should be to make use of black markets and to encourage their growth. And maybe this might tie into some stuff I've talked about before. Like, I have a blog post I put up recently about that, about DIY hormones. That I think that DIY hormones and DIY gender confirmation technologies, be they pharmaceutical or surgical, are basically going to end up being a necessary kind of component to gender accelerationism. Because I don't because I because as long as being trans is basically imprisoned in capitalism as we know it, as like a kind of corporate oligopoly, where the protocols for synthesizing hormones are all like held behind draconian patent laws and all that. I don't think that gender accelerationism is really going to be able to flourish until we get to a point where DIY hormone hacking, DIY body hacking, and all of that becomes more viable. I mean, we're already seeing that to some extent with CRISPR, and I think that that's just going to become more and more. That's going to become more and more going to gain more momentum, and the more that stuff like this gains momentum, the more it becomes impossible for the state basically to police and regulate even trans people and transitioning. Because even today, I mentioned a couple minutes ago that in the 90s it was really, really hard to transition. Even today, I was I was in when I was in California. I was living in California still when I started started HRT. And even today in California, the most liberal state in the country, you still have to go, well, at least for what my healthcare provider was. It also varies, but even today, you have to you at least have to do as a formality, you have to go to a therapist and have them they have to talk to you and ask you about your gender history and all that before you can get signed on to start taking HRT. And being somebody who's very opposed to stuff, very opposed to the state and control and intellectual property and all of that kind of stuff, I think that it's going to be a great accelerant for that kind of stuff to become anybody can do it. Anybody can just download the plans to download the protocols to synthesize their own hormones and use household products to do it. So anyway, that's an extremely long-winded question, but basically, I think that in the cases of people like underground body mod people, that's basically just they're spearheading what I think is going to be the future for gender acceleration type stuff.
Okay, that was an excellent answer. So it just so happens that we're now getting inundated with new questions, and unfortunately, people, I'm really sorry, but we're not going to be able to answer them all. I've been on this stream for 3 hours.
They can ask me on my retro spring also.
There you go. You can ask Nyx questions directly if you want. Or what I was going to say, Nyx, is because, I mean, it's been really fun talking with you and really illuminating and fascinating. So since there seems to be lots of questions and people want to hear you talk about more stuff, we could just do this again in the future sometime if you're game.
Yeah, sure. I think that before we leave, though, we need to talk about necrophilia.
Okay.
We need to talk about the necrophilia question because everybody. I think that your camera or something cut out.
Hey,
Audio.
Sorry, I dropped out. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Sorry, I think my computer probably overheated. Yes, okay. I have just enough brain glucose to have a short discussion about necrophilia, if you'd like.
Yes. I love to talk about necrophilia.
The questions that we're getting right now are about, I don't know if you're following the chat, but people really want us to talk about slime girls, which, to be honest, I would quite like to know more about slime girls, because that's another thing I just don't understand at all, really. But we don't have to do all of this tonight. Like I said, I can make a note of these things and I'll put them in a little file, and we could just do a round two at some point later at your convenience, if you wish, Nyx. But we can talk about. So I'll make a note of these other questions, but we can talk about necrophilia. So, what should we talk about?
I can talk about necrophilia and slime girls right now. Also, if you have the bandwidth to do both of them. Otherwise, I think we at the very least need to talk about necrophilia.
All right, you know what? If you're game, let's do it. I just need to, let me get a glass of water or something, and we'll do both. If you want to.
Yep, that's perfect. Sounds great.
Cool. I'm always the one who wants to go deeper, go longer in talking, and so if someone wants to, I'm down to push myself to the absolute breaking point of how long I can go. So, all right, everyone, I'll be right back. Maybe Nyx, you could talk to them about something real quick when I'm gone.
I need to find the stream.
You can, if you go to the video page, you should be able to pop out the chat. Or I could just give you something off here to riff on.
Well, it's on YouTube, right?
Yeah, if you go to the YouTube page, you should be able to see the chat.
Can you
Oh,
DM me that not on Twitter, on the other
yeah,
thing?
yeah, sure, sure. But I won't be too long. Can I just give you like a random topic off the chat? Um,
Sure.
unless you just want it for your own. Uh,
Now just give me a random topic.
cool. So here's someone wants you to talk about do you want to talk about someone says talk about Kevin Carson. Do you want to just for a minute while I run to the bathroom and get a drink of water?
What specifically about Kevin Carson? That's a pretty broad question.
Yeah, I know. Someone just said let's see. Oh, and Lee says thank you, by the way. Um let's see. Duh, duh, duh. This chat is funny. You'll have to read it on your own time. It's like some pretty interesting. Who's Brian Silva? I have no clue. Um,
I
uh,
don't know.
okay, look, I'll be back in like 20 seconds. I'm sure people can wait. People, if you're listening to this, you go take a bathroom break or get a drink of water or something. We'll be right back. And Nix, if you want to riff about anything in the 30 seconds while I'm gone, feel free. I'll be right back.
All right. Well, I guess as far as Kevin Carson goes, I really need to open the chat. I don't have it in front of me right now. Uh, I'm not super well read with Kevin Carson's stuff yet. He's written a couple books that are rather long, and I'm trying to find the YouTube link right now. Um, yeah, Kevin Carson's written a couple really long books, and the stuff that I've read from him has been what was it? I I'm let's see. It was only like a couple of his older essays. One of them was on neoliberalism and professionalism or something like that, and something else was on intellectual property or something like that. I don't know, but yeah, I think I mean Kevin Carson is one of the. Oh, look who's back. Yeah, I was just talking about.
Talking shit about me? No,
I was just rambling about Kevin Carson. I'm because I've read a little bit of his stuff, but I'm not super familiar with him. Like the thing that resonated with me the most about Kevin Carson's like basic beliefs and why I bring him up a lot is his idea of market anarchism as a basically like a mode of achieving communism, because it seems to for me be a very like uh, dialectical, I guess. Like it seems to just work as far as like Marx's ideology, or not Marx's ideology. That's extremely wrong to call it an ideology. As far as like his political economy goes, but obviously also uh, being an accelerationist, I would think of Marx as being kind of an accelerationist himself. But yeah, I mean, as far as like Kevin Carson goes, and why I specifically talk about Kevin Carson when talking about market anarchism, I think that Kevin Carson is great because he is, first of all, he's has a modern take on mutualism, and it's a form of anarchism that allows for the market without regressing into basically being a form of statism, which is what I think anarcho-capitalism is. Like, I think that all of anarcho-capitalism is basically trying to legislate the same exact things that the state does, but in something that they consider to be acceptable in their own worldview. So, like the non-aggression principle, for instance, and how they talk about like how they're so into peace and stuff, and how they just want everybody to get along, and how the world that they imagine is going to be so great and nice. That's kind of, for me, is just a exactly the same sort of discourse that people who are proponents of the state also talk about. That, like, I mean, the whole point of like a new world order type thing would be the ultimate form of peace, where there's no war at all because there's one authoritarian world government ruling everything. So like not the non-aggression principle is the same sort of idea, except you're just legislating it into something that's considered ethically correct in Lockean terms. And also, I don't really give a fuck about Locke. So I also don't. So I'm also not interested in like Lockean ethics. I had to read Locke for an empiricist class that I took in undergrad. So that's the extent of what I know about him. Hopefully that answers the question to some extent about my thoughts on Kevin Carson.
Sounds
And
good. It sounds like you know more about him than I do. I just haven't really been able to get to all of that stuff. I know about it through people like Edmund Berger and Uriello and stuff, but I haven't really given too much attention to it. So I could barely say anything. So that was good. I think we should talk about the really pressing issues of necrophilia and slime girls. Um, if people have,
necrophilia and slime girls are definitely the two most important questions that I'm glad we saved for last, because GIAC, Lesbian Neoreaction, the total feminization of the human race, the end of all human biological reproduction, that's great and all, but slime girls and necrophilia are where it's at.
this is pretty epic. This is a pretty epic conversation because we've covered gender accelerationism, lesbian neoreaction, and at the 3 hour mark, we're only just now getting to slime girls and necrophilia. So how about we
I
start?
think you were going to say something about if the people from the chat wanted to ask anything about it too just now.
Oh yeah, yeah. Well, since you were asking us to talk about these things, I guess you were saying slime girls in particular, the chat, that is, people in the chat. If you have maybe more specific questions, now would be a useful time to type them in, and we can try to address them. But otherwise, how about you could just start by telling me? I think you might have sent me links or at some point, or we chatted about it, but I don't think I got around to really reading anything about slime girls, so I literally have no idea what it is. Maybe you could just tell me, like briefly.
Yeah, so slime girls are, I mean, obviously it's related to GIAC and feminization and whatnot. Slime girls to me are basically, I mean, on the one hand, slime girls are just a thing from like the Monster Girl community that has like a bunch of role playing type visual novels and games and lots of lewd anime artwork type stuff.
So
And
it's like a type of anime character.
it's not from, I don't, as far as I know, there aren't any like anime series or manga that have like that have slime girls in them. It's more of like Monster Girls is just is like a community that is a community that's based around, I'm pretty sure it's based around a visual novel or something, or that's where it started. I don't know about the whole community. My main interest is obviously with Slime Girls. Slime Girls is also a chip tune band that I really like. Though I didn't find out about them until after getting into Slime Girls as a just the broader thing.
If
And
you
a while
go, sorry, go on. I'm just browsing. I'll browse as you talk. Go for it.
okay. Yeah, some people might remember a while back that I posted a something from the gematriculator. I don't even know how to say it because I've never had to say the word. But basically, yeah, the Kabbalah numerancy on Akira's site. The slime girl acceleration is equal to involuntary celibacy or involuntary celibates or something,
Okay.
which I thought was very interesting. I thought that was a very interesting kind of occult synchronicity. Um, and as far as like slime girls relate to my actual thought and not just to me shit posting slime girls because I think it's funny that it grosses people out, which is definitely not the main reason why I started talking about slime girls in the first place. There's deep, important, very intellectual reasons behind this. Um, But yeah, I think that as far as slime girls go, it's really just a continuation of gender accelerationism into basically theory fiction, where I think that the future of the human race, to whatever extent the human race can even be said to have any continuity, is slimification. So there was this article that came out recently, like a couple days ago, that I retweeted, that was talking about new discoveries with slime molds. And slime molds are very fascinating in their own right. They were used to be thought of as a fungus, but they're now thought of as more of a single cell organism, like an amoeba. And slime molds are very interesting because they
Is this the wrong kind of monster girl?
yeah.
Okay. Sorry, I don't mean
I
to.
don't know.
I don't mean to distract you. I am listening too, by the way. Go on.
If you don't mind showing not safe for work stuff on here, you could go to 8chan.net/monster.
Okay. Will that like get my videos banned off YouTube or something?
It
I'll
might not be. Maybe you shouldn't. And it might not be. It might not be safe to do that for your
Okay. I'll do
YouTube.
research
I
on
don't know.
I'll do research on if I'm allowed to do that in the future. We'll figure it out. So go on. I didn't mean to interrupt. I don't want to interrupt.
Yeah. So slime molds are very interesting because slime molds, they're single-celled organisms like an amoeba, but they also are able to swarm together into the molds or blobs that are the slime molds or blobs that are what people typically think of them as. And they do this when when they don't have enough food in their environment. The recent studies found that slime molds are able to, it's at least it seems, are able to learn, and they're able to remember what they've learned, and they're also able to transfer things that they've learned to other slime mold cells or organisms, I guess, because they're single celled organisms, but they're able to
What?
transfer
Wow.
what they've learned to
Wait,
like they
slime molds are able to learn. Really?
at least that's what scientific findings suggest, which is a very compelling and very very kind of new thing to discover, because previously, we thought of learning and intelligence as being something that's privileged only to like complex multicellular organisms. So the ability for slime molds to seemingly be able to learn, the experiment that they did was they basically had like a slime mold and then some sugar across from it, and then in the between it was like this bitter substance that slime molds don't like. And the slime molds eventually learned that they could get across the this is probably a butchering the experiment a bit, but you can just look up this article. It came out super recently. And actually, I can also find it right now just so I have the article. But
I think I
so
found it.
basically,
I'll pull it up. Go ahead.
it was from Quanta magazine.
Yep, I found it.
Yeah, that one. Anyway, so basically, they were able to. It looks like able to learn, and also like after being frozen for a year, were able to remember what they had learned. And also, when they swarm together, because when slime molds swarm when slime mold when the organisms swarm together, they basically form like bridges to each other, and they can transfer information doing that. Not only this though, but previous studies have suggested that slime molds are able to do complex reasoning. There was a famous example that's talked about in this article where slime molds recreated the Tokyo railway system, and they seem to be able to use some form of reasoning skills. So the fact that, not the fact, but whatever, the suggested findings that slime molds are able to learn and able to use complex reasoning and also transmit data would mean that there's some form of primitive intelligence that is we previously had never thought could be possible. And I find this very compelling from a theoretical point of view, because if you think about it, slime molds are basically a very primitive, kind of primordial even, realization of what complex multicellular organisms are all striving towards, which is one.
Right. Right. Oh, hey, Nix, did you drop out? Uh-oh. The New World Order is very threatened by this discovery of slime, and they're now clamping down on our ability to communicate. This is very...
Hello?
Yes, are you back?
Yeah, I lost the stream for some reason.
I was just saying, I think our discussion about slime is getting a little too close to the core of world power, and that's why our stream getting mysteriously disconnected.
Yeah, I know, right?
Also, real quick, can I just observe that in this article, do you notice that all of the scientists are women? Like, we got this woman, and then the author is a woman, and what I'm thinking is, well, let's see if there's any other. Okay, so the slime knowledge discovery and the slime reporting seems to be a woman-dominated affair. That's a data point for lesbian neoreaction. But also, what I'm finding now is that if you look at the author here, I don't know where this person comes from, but Katya Moskvich, that sounds Russian, which it probably means she's working for Putin, which probably means she has connections to Trump. And I'm now wondering if this slime phenomenon and its representatives, maybe, I don't know, maybe Moldbuck has something to do with this.
It's all connected together. I'm like Charlie Kelly from It's Always Sunny at the board with all the things connected together, all frazzled, making connections. But yeah, so basically what I was getting at before the stream got cut off is that I think that slime molds are basically a primitive form of what all complex multicellular organisms are striving towards, which is a cybernetic networked kind of organism society that swarms together to survive, because that's literally what a slime mold is, and it's able to share information very easily and learn as a whole thing. But not only that, I think that slime molds are superior to humans and other complex organisms because humans are complex. Complexity is bad. Simplicity is good. Coming from a software engine, coming from like a software perspective, it's something that's primitive and simple that's able to do the same thing as what human beings have not yet fully figured out. Because we have the internet now, and the internet, like I said earlier, is experiencing a renaissance of decentralization. After a period of re-centralization. But we haven't yet even reached a point that slime molds are at, where slime molds are able to fluidly both atomize themselves and also unify themselves and swarm together depending on whatever the flows of their environment dictate. And as far as slime girls work into all this, I think the connection between slime molds and gender acceleration is kind of apparent now. That slime girls are just this phenomenon of slimification, of intending towards fluidity and simplicity, and a form of atomization that is almost indistinguishable from swarming together, an as above so below type thing. Slime girls are just symbolic of the ultimate end goal, or not even end goal, but whatever the ultimate results that accelerationism has on humans, of being a slimified, feminized, feminist being, not feminist, feminized being commingling with itself.
So is it fair to say that in your model, the lesbian neoreaction patch will be headed up by slime girls, probably? Lesbian slime girls, probably? Is that fair to say?
Well, I think that slime girls are imminently lesbian because, like I said, it's a commingling of the slime with itself. And even in the case of like, you know, like in like most monster girl role playing and fiction and stuff like that is based around slime girls, like slime girl, or not slime, monster girls as a whole is kind of interesting because it's a simplified a very simplified and but very long-standing male fantasy of woman as a chaotic and primordial thing that needs to be tamed. That's why all the women, or all the women in slime in like the monster girl fandom are monsters, and all of the heroes are men, and the man is, and there's always a sexual component to it too, where the man is like basically defeating this monster girl with his dick. So um but in the case of slime girls, the male who gets killed by a slime girl gets dissolved into the slime and not just simply eaten or something. And as far as actually existing lesbian RX goes, I think that in the long term future, that the lesbian RX patch becomes eventually it moves out of the planet entirely and becomes it becomes a space colony, space patchwork. And as humans adapt to living in space, they no longer require even for their bodies to be rigid and and you know, have a strong like skeletal muscular structure, because there's no gravity, and that gets replaced by having the controlled environment of being in mech suits. So basically, the lesbian RX patch is slime girls invading space in Gundams and destroying the planet from there.
Okay. I'm like exploding I'm galaxy brain right now. Exploding brain. Maybe I might be being too literal, and you're kind of just maybe being more mimetic and perhaps being more creative. So I don't mean to be overly rigid or patriarchal, but I guess one thought I have is I'm just curious, like, is there any like plausible like evolutionary law, like how would we as complex organisms like become slime? Like how is that, like, what's like the pathway there?
Well, on the one hand, I think that on the one hand, it's partly just mimetic and symbolic, and then um, on the other, I'm like I was saying, there's the effect that zero gravity environments will have on the human body, where we'll adapt to them and not have a need to really be anything other than kind of like a blob of organs. Um, and maybe eventually a body without organs entirely, once we no longer have a need for our like for any kind of a for any of our actual like our like literal physiological processes to be in our bodies, and could be outsourced or alienated into techno capital, as we become kind of imminently plugged into techno capital. As far as like a literal transformation, it's at least the closest I can see as far as a literal transformation into becoming slime girls, of like actually becoming a collection of single-celled organisms. But then, like, also talking about it in terms of like in terms of cybernetics, because even if we get to a point where our bodies are basically completely useless and are basically just the brains for mech suits that are a controlled environment we have for like in cases of being in gravity environments. Um, at some point, at some point, I think that I guess, and I guess this is kind of just getting into a surprisingly a much broader question as far as accelerationism goes, of like what happens to humans when patchwork turns into AI inevitably taking over and overtaking humanity entirely as like a superior form of intelligence. And if you'll notice in the Matrix, all of the people that are all the humans that are in the Matrix are basically in a slime womb.
Okay. Right. Okay, I see where you're going with that. And you know what else I could add to that is like kind of what you were saying before, that the like the soy boy or the and also like the bug man. Like these are kinds of images of like human bodies being kind of like physically like scrunched down into like maybe
And
an
also softened.
yeah, exactly, like maybe on a vector that heads towards slime. I could see that.
Yeah, and then like I was also saying in like a symbolic sense, there's either in a symbolic sense, I think that framing things in terms of the Matrix, which I mean, I honestly hate how much the Matrix gets used as like for this kind of discourse because it's so played out, but it's also useful, I guess. But I think that like the literal like the literal like Matrix that everybody is hooked into is a form of being a slime where all of consciousness is promiscuously commingling with each other in the same sort of network. Uh,
Okay.
yeah, just
Okay.
ultimate fluidity.
And so are slime girls also do they like fucking corpses generally, or is there a connection here or no?
I think that slime girls probably would just like eating the corpses, so they'd be necrophagists instead of necrophiliacs. But
Whoa.
that's a good segue into talking about necrophilia now.
Right. So maybe is like in the lesbian neo-reactionary patch is necrophilia enshrined as like a standard custom and regular kind of like ritual, like a very normal kind of everyday sexual practice.
You know, I don't. It's funny talking about necrophilia because when it was originally brought up, I only mentioned it because one, I have no social awareness and didn't realize that most people are shocked and disgusted at the idea of necrophilia. Like when I brought it up because there was like some minor drama in left Twitter over some like one of the prominent people in it saying something about thinking that necrophilia is fine, and I they deleted their tweet after that, and I was like, and I just jumped into it for the controversy and because I thought it was funny, and I was like, nah, necrophilia is fine actually, and then I said actually necrophilia is less wrong than eating meat, and I actually do believe that. And I'm not even a vegan or a vegetarian. I mean, I mentioned in earlier, and I also talked about this in a retro spring question that I think that the meat industry and eating meat just in general is like an unnecessary kind of luxury practice that is it's very wasteful in terms of all the land and resources that are required to produce meat that could instead be replaced with soylent or soy based products. But um, yeah, I mean, I really do believe that eating meat is worse than necrophilia. One, because of all of the huge amounts of damage that it does to the environment, and all the other problems associated with it, and also because you're killing something rather than perturbing a corpse that's already dead, and assuming that you have the consent of the person who died, then that's their own bodily autonomy to let somebody fuck their corpse when they die, and nobody can say anything otherwise. But I mean, that's just like a very basic utilitarian ethics argument, and I'm not, as I think alluded to previously in this chat, I'm not I'm not really into I'm not really into ethics, I guess. I mean, that sounds like super edgy, but like I mean, I'm very much a Nietzschean, I guess, in that I'm more into analyzing the meta ethics of ethics and not talking about like what's the most right and what's the most wrong, because I think it's kind of a dead end argument. Um, yeah, basically I think an entire school of philosophy that has been around since ancient Greece is just a useless dead end. But um, yeah, I mean that's just a really basic utilitarian argument that people kind of thought was shocking and ridiculous. and it did kind of I did kind of think it was I mean I thought it was really funny because I've always found necrophilia to be fascinating since I first learned about it, which was I don't remember when this was, if it was when I was a sophomore in high school or maybe a little earlier than that. But I had heard a song by the metal band Slayer, and the song was called Necrophiliac. And I didn't know at the time what that was, and then I looked into it, and my response to it at first was, "You can do that?" I never considered the possibility that you could do something like that, and I found it really interesting. Um, and I think it's also interesting to think about in terms of like Bataille. I'm probably not pronouncing his name right, but Georges Bataille, and you know, the relationship between death and sensuality.
Oh, I say bataille. I'm not sure if that's
Bataille.
yeah.
That's probably I don't know. I don't speak French,
I think it's bataille.
unfortunately.
I think it's bataille.
Bataille.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, well, I think it's very interesting to think about in terms of Bataille and also Desaad
Mhm.
of like necrophilia as being the I guess you know, I guess it kind of depends also on how you're talking about necrophilia, because I was like thinking about something similar to this the other day, uh thinking about like fascist morality, fascist ethics, like hyper fascist Kantian universalist ethics versus more like experimental types that allow for difference to take place and for whatever's the best to win out. And it's interesting thinking about this in terms of necrophilia, because like, necrophilia is one of the few sexual taboos that most people would never ever find acceptable.
Yeah.
Like, even in our
Other,
fairly
other than pedophilia, maybe.
yeah, well, definitely that's the other one.
Yeah.
That and pedophilia, necrophilia. Um, that's I mean,
I
there are
think
other
those are
cases.
yeah, those are the big ones that people really just are not cool with even thinking about really. And it's funny because like, you know, our culture is definitely increasingly open to like all different types of, you know, liberal norms around sexuality and queering. But thou shalt not talk about pedophilia or necrophilia.
And I think, yeah, I mean, you know, honestly, it would be really interesting. I'm only just now thinking about this talking to you, but it would be really, really interesting to kind of put the two against each other for what I was just getting at, of like necrophilia as like a like transgression that's so extreme that it completely is. It's basically like an exit from all discourse around sexuality and consent, where where you're basically having sexual desires for something that is a copy of a human. Not, I mean, not like a literally like a copy, but like it's an imitation, I guess, of a human,
Yeah.
because it's something that used to be alive and is not, but and looks like a human.
Right.
And also it also is interesting to think about that, and like the nature of necrophilia, and desire for something that's desire for death, and also necrophilia, and to think of that, and also like how this might work for AI and sex bots and stuff like that. That's become kind of a popular thing to talk about in the past year or so. Like, there's been lots of articles about sex bots, because on the one hand, necrophilia a is desiring like, you know, literally coldness and death in a negative sense, and desire being plugged into something like like AI, like the eroticization of technology, is also a desire for death, but it's a desire for a positive death, where the desire that is supposed to be productive, like like in
Right.
a like literal biological sense of like producing more humans is being hacked, and being hacked either, you know, maybe in like a maybe in like a mutual way, but of like both the person who's eroticizing technology, and then also techno capital itself is hacking human sexuality by making us desire a simulation of sexuality, or a desire a simulation of sexual intercourse. And so it's like the positive necrophilia that
Talking about. I'll have to really think about that.
hello.
Are you back?
Yeah, I was just saying, basically, you're two types of necrophilia. I mean, there's necrophilia as a broad concept that's typically applied to just literally fucking corpses, and then there's necrophilia in like a Landian sense of positive death and machinic desire, where you're desiring something that is and eroticizing something that is similarly a an inhuman but appears to be human.
Yeah. You know what I also just thought listening to you is that it seems pretty obvious to me that if you connect a few dots, you can easily imagine corpses playing a key role in kind of yeah, like this new frontier of simulated like sex bots, basically. Because think about it, like what is one of the main ways of doing like the most sophisticated like surgical repairs right now? It's using cadavers, you know. So like if you if you need like a ligament fixed, or like your knee or shoulder or whatever, like it's common to use cadavers to replace your broken parts. So if you take that as one data point, one vector, if you will, sorry, Nix, I should tell you the chat is making fun of me for saying these things over and over again. But if you take that as a data point, seriously, and then you look to like things like VR and like I don't know if you saw, like recently, my friend Diana Fleischman wrote a really good article about how like the rise of sex bots is going to affect like sexual competition dynamics, and like that's obviously going to be a massive market that is like on the brink. So it seems to me like an obvious inference is that they will sooner or later use corpses as the material for like the ideal sex bot, right?
Yeah, when you started talking about that, I immediately was like, corpses that are reanimated for sex.
Exactly. I can totally see that. And
That's
yeah.
That's very interesting. I think that I might have seen, but I haven't read the article yet because I was going to read it once I start writing like the Lesbian RX manifesto. The Diana Fleischman thing, was it on Jacobite?
Yeah, and actually, now that I think about it, you might find some data points in that for lesbian neoreaction, because she basically talks about how sex bots are going to affect the distribution of power across the genders. It's quite interesting.
Yeah, there are a couple points in Lesbian RX's political topology or whatever, where sex bots are like, I mean, I kind of hate to make this comparison because of how it's been memed and what the community is around it now. But I'm gonna do it anyway at the risk of my social clout. There's an episode of Rick and Morty from like season 2 or maybe 1 where they go to this dimension where there's a there's this race of like hyper masculine warlike aliens that compete for sex bots, basically. And the sex bots then get taken back by this advanced society, like basically Amazonian society of women, and they use like the sperm that from these sex bots to make more of themselves. And so that's kind of roughly parallels that same idea, but I think about it more in terms of how I was saying earlier, that I think that AI and I agree with Sadie Plant and Amy Ireland and a lot of other like xenofeminists and cyber feminists, that AI and women share a kinship with each other. And I was just talking about how there's like the positive and negative necrophilia of like literal necrophilia that eroticizes death, the death of the like negative death of humanity, versus the positive death of like what comes after the death of humanity, the eroticization of techno capital, basically. So I think that really sex bots are just like a psyop that arrives from the future for lesbian RX, that is saying that the more competition there is for sex bots, and the more superior they are, or the more desired they are than women for like by men for sex, then the more that it accelerates the kind of the separation and the war between the two sexes, because then on both sides there seems to be no further need for men. And not only that, but in the case of sex bots, it's you're literally dumping your genes into a black hole. That's completely unproductive, and that's great, and that's probably a fear that a lot of reactionaries have about sex bots. That, I mean, it's really just part of like broader fears about traditional values dying, and about people having sex for sex's sake and not for reproduction. Yeah, it's this article. I have this bookmarked to read once I start Lesbian RX. But yeah,
Oh, I'm pretty sure that Diana would agree with what you basically just laid out. So that's really interesting. I just wanted to give Diana's article a shout out, because I think you'll find it supports your priors, I think.
Yeah. So basically, I would say maybe that will necrophilia be practiced in the lesbian RX patch? Yes, definitely. It'll be practiced on the one hand in the sense of, well, at least on the one hand in the sense of the kind of the positive necrophilia, the positive death of humanity, the lesbian autoproduction that takes place in Lesbian RX, and in like post-human accelerationism, techno capital in general, where human beings are no longer necessary and no longer part of the production process. And then, just going off of the comparison of AI with women, then it's literally a lesbian autoproduction.
So you know what, Nix? What's interesting is looking over Diana's article. She's also talking about, or I forget what her focus is, but like for instance, if you look at this quote, I'm not sure if that's legible to you, but she's talking about about female replaceability. So in her view, I guess it's kind of conflictual with what you're saying. So it'd be interesting to hear like how you come down on it. I'm saying that now that I think about it, she's talking about how sex bots are going to undermine the power of women, and that she seems to think a lot of the feminist anxiety right now is kind of dealing with like what's quoted here, like the specter of female replaceability. So that's kind of actually like a little bit like the opposite of what you're saying. Is that right? Or maybe it's more consistent than I think.
It's an interesting point, but I think it's also completely wrong, because, and Sadie Plant talks about this in Zeros Plus Ones, that it's a sperm cell compared to an egg is extremely simple to reproduce, or not, like to make an artificial copy of, whereas the egg cell and the womb and all of that is far more complicated and expensive. So it's, I mean, the replaceability, it's not just the replaceability of like male or female, it's the replaceability of meat as a whole. But in terms of men and women, the market favors women.
Well, what's interesting is because what she's saying is that the market it disfavors women because the market demand for sex bots will be more from men wanting female sex bots. So I think one of the reasons why actually like her implications are at odds with yours is because I think now that I remember her article more, you're talking about different things because you're talking specifically about the ability to technologically hack like reproduction, whereas she's talking just about, I think if I recall, just sexual satisfaction. So basically, like men can get their pleasure without women. Like men don't need living women to get their pleasure. Of course, they might not reproduce for that reason, but yeah. So I don't know.
Well,
I mean,
yeah. I mean, I think that we have the same view, but we have different takes on it. Because obviously obviously being the proponent of lesbian RX, being queer and all that, I don't give a shit if men don't have a desire for biological women. In fact, that's great because that just displaces all of their aggression and displaces all of their aggression onto something that they can abuse as much as they want, basically, without it affecting. I mean, except for in the case of like if hard AI becomes possible, and obviously lesbian RX will have to liberate all the sex bots. But otherwise, as like just a simple like robotic, like without any intelligence type thing, I mean, that's great. There's it's not this idea of like a feminist anxiety about the meat no longer being desired. uh to whatever extent that's true, I think that that's in the case of feminists who have very bad opinions and have a very bad form of feminism, where they think that the basically where they have this gross like biological kind of fetishization of women, and like how about like the womb and all that shit, and how like the womb and motherhood and all that is defines being a woman for them. Like that's pretty common with a lot of feminism, and especially with like turfy type stuff. Um, Whereas how I look at it, from my like radical feminist GAC lesbian RX blob of ideas.
slime blob, if you will, of ideas.
Yeah, exactly. Um, that's just the further emancipation of women by them not only not having not only not needing to like not only not needing to reproduce in order like not having the biological duty to reproduce, but not even having like the simulation of that, like the cultural residue of that around anymore, like not even having to deal with the desires of men and the aggression that results from that and the oppression that results from
Right.
all that.
Well,
So
you know what just occurred to me is that actually like Diana's different take on a slightly different angle of the question is actually I think could be synthesized with what you're saying in the larger gender accelerationist idea because basically, I mean, if Diana's right and there are these technological forces, vectors, if you will, that are making basically are enabling men to please themselves without having to actually engage with and negotiate with and compromise with living human females, then that's going to like accelerate the gender contradictions, if you will, right? Like that's going to, in some sense, that is mutually reinforcing with like the lesbian neo-reaction vector, right? Because like at the same time, like the more men withdraw from physical sex with human females, the more it will incentivize and encourage like the rejected human like females or non-males to start like supercharging their like technological auto reproduction or something.
yeah, it's not it both of that, and it also encourages, I think, women it encourages heterosexual women then, or quote unquote heterosexual, to um to basically seek an exit to follow lesbian X to the exit from patriarchy. That's something I should have said earlier on, but I think that in a word, lesbian X is the neo-reactionary tendency to search for an exit applied to patriarchy.
Okay, that's a nice, succinct way to put it.
Yeah, but like that's like you said, that's an accelerant. It's also an accelerant in the sense that it accelerates this this like hatred of the sexes, this disparity between men and women, where even straight women are going to end up being incentivized to seek an exit from patriarchy. And fortunately for women, female sexuality is more fluid than male sexuality. At least that's what's what seems to be suggested in a lot of cases. For whatever reason, whether that has any biological or cultural reasons behind it. But so in all but like the cases of women who are too far gone in the heterosexual mind virus to save themselves, then that's just going to incentivize more women to join lesbian RX and to leave behind masculinity to basically just die off in complete impotence in a broad sense of like not producing anything, all of their desires going into a black hole of the products of techno capital, sex bots.
I think that's a perfect last word. I'm going to let that be the last word. I'm coming up on 4 hours now and I'm totally fried. But this has been totally awesome. I mean, we've covered so much ground and it's been so wild and fascinating. And yeah, I hope, have you enjoyed yourself talking with me?
Yeah, I haven't done any like radio type or I mean I've never done any podcasty type stuff, mostly because too many people do it and it annoys me. So I just kind of for very edgy and dumb reasons just declined to do it. But I've been wanting to do radio again for like a long time, and because I used to be a DJ, and I hopefully soon will once I get my server set sorted out for that, we'll have like a web radio show again. But yeah, this has
Awesome.
been
Awesome. Yeah, no, I know it is podcasting and stuff like that is trendy, I suppose, but you know, that's not a reason to stop us from, you know, making these sorts of things worthwhile in our own ways. I also want to just give a huge shout out to all the crazy people who have been with us this entire time. That's really epic. This has been like a really long and wild ride. So, you know, we had like 50 people with us for like most of the time, and we've actually had no less than about like 30 people with us this entire time, and active in the chat. So to you 30 crazy people who've been here the entire time, thank you so much. It's been fun to have you here with us, and it really just helps things, you know, keeps the energy up and makes it fun. So thanks for your engagement and everything. So thanks to everyone. And Nyx, I'm sure there's lots of stuff that we, you know, haven't got to cover, but that's always going to be the case. And if you ever want to do this again, you know, my DMs are open, as they say, do whenever.
Yeah, maybe after I've published GIAC and Lesbian RX. Like I said, GIAC is going to be getting published pretty soon. I'm also just now reading through my notifications on Twitter, and slightly amused at Depopulator saying that I sound more masculine than you.
Oh gosh, I haven't looked. I wouldn't dare look at my notifications right now until this is over. But
yeah, we could probably do this again sometime, or maybe when I have a radio show, have some people on. I mostly wanted to just make it for playing music, but could maybe also do some talk type stuff sometime. But yeah, this has been good talk, good conversations.
I'm glad you found it worthwhile too. So it, you know, it wouldn't be worth it to me if it wasn't, you know, at least somewhat enjoyable and edifying for you. I mean, I think this is cool because this is at least until your writings come out, this is currently kind of like, I would say, the most available and comprehensive statement of your views on these things, at least as far as I've been able to find. So that feels good. That feels like an accomplishment.
Yeah, it's all so far been scattered Twitter stuff and then my notes and drafts that I have hidden away until they're obsessively polished enough to be ready for publication. So yeah, I agree.
Awesome. All right. Well, I'll let you go then. And all the people in the chat, I see you. Thanks for all your kind words. By the way, we've gotten a lot of love throughout all of this. You've especially got a lot of nice comments in the chat. So make sure you go and read them, Nyx. I think you'll find, a lot of, people were like really into what you were talking the whole time. So thanks everyone. Thank you, Nyx. And let's end it, shall we?
Yep. Bye.
All right. Good night. Talk to you later.
Yep.
All right. There goes Nyx. Good night, everybody. I'm out of here. Like I said, make sure you subscribe if you haven't, and also look out for the private community that I'm building. You all can join if you want to. Just shoot me a message if you're interested in it, and I'll let you know when it's like ready for you to join us. If you want to kind of just do a better job of staying in touch with me and knowing when I do these streams and knowing when future projects are coming out, like if you want to, be kept up to date with all of that stuff better and talk with like the other people in the chat or whatever that has kind of emerged around the stuff I'm doing, just shoot me a message and we'll work it out. All right. Good night, everybody. I'm so totally fried. This is by far the longest stream or podcast I think I've ever done, actually. But that was fascinating. It was really, really interesting stuff. I'm going to have to digest that for a while. All right, everyone. Good night.